The night is dark and echoing of vampires.
There is a version of this story where Bella Swan goes to Phoenix and comes home changed in the way everyone expected, where James finds her in the ballet studio and bites her wrist, and the venom does what venom is supposed to do: converts, destroys, rebuilds in the image of something that is no longer human, where Edward arrives in time to pull the poison from her blood, and she survives and returns to Forks, still breakable, still mortal, still the girl who needed saving. That is the version everyone prepared for. That is not what happened. What happened in that ballet studio on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of Bella Swan's 17th year was something that had no precedent in the careful, ancient records of either the Cullen family or the Quileute tribe. What happened was something that had been sleeping inside her bones since before she was born, coiled in the double helix of her blood like a question no one thought to ask, waiting for a pressure so extreme that the only possible response was detonation. What happened was that the thing James created, the terror, the pain, the cellular assault of vampire venom on a human body, was precisely the wrong thing to do to this particular girl. James did not know about Charlie Swan's mother. He did not know that the woman who raised Charlie in a small house on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula carried in her blood a lineage older than the town of Forks itself, older than the treaty, older than the Cullen family's careful arrangement with the land. He did not know that the Quileute gene, the one that had been activating in the young men of La Push for 2 years in response to the Cullen family's proximity, was not exclusively a paternal inheritance. He did not know that it could lie dormant for a generation, skip the carrier, sleep through an entire childhood in a girl who spent her adolescence in Phoenix thinking the cold made her clumsy. He did not know any of this. He knew she was Bella Swan, and she was Edward Cullen's girl, and that was enough to make her worth hunting. He found her because she let him find her. She had listened to the voicemail of her mother's voice, not Renee's voice at all, but a recording James had made using the footage he'd stolen, and she had believed it. Because she was 17 and she loved her mother, and that is exactly the kind of thing a 17-year-old does. She'd left a note for Edward, told Alice she was going to the bathroom, slipped out of the hotel and taken a cab to the ballet studio where she'd trained as a child, which James had chosen specifically because it was familiar enough to feel safe and isolated enough to ensure no interference. He was a tracker. He understood how people moved toward comfort when they were afraid. The studio smelled of rosin and sweat and old mirrors. The afternoon light came through the high windows at a low angle and hit the floor in long stripes. Bella stood in the center of the room and knew immediately that she had made a mistake. The phone James had been using to play Renee's voice fell silent. He stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the studio like something from a nightmare, fluid and pale and smiling with the particular pleasure of someone who has just closed a trap. He was theatrical about it. She would give him that after, in the moments of clarity she would have between what came next. He understood performance. He moved around her the way a conductor moves around a stage before the music starts, taking his time. Because the chase was over and now came the part he actually enjoyed. He told her what he was going to do. He told her that Edward would find the recording he'd made of this, that Edward would hear every moment of what was about to happen to her, that this was the point, not the kill. The message. He broke her leg first. The sound it made was not the clean snap that gets described in films. It was wet and complicated, and the pain was something she had no reference point for, something that rewrote her understanding of what pain meant in the space of a single second. She hit the mirror wall hard, the glass cracking, and the floor came up and she was on her hands and one knee with her left leg refusing to hold weight, and the rosin and sweat smell of the studio replaced by something else, the sweetness of him. The overwhelming, nauseating sweetness that she'd always found beautiful on Edward and that now, in proximity to something that wanted her dead, smelled like wrong, like predator. She did not know yet why she was reading it that way. She only knew that her body was doing something without her instruction, flooding with adrenaline at a rate that didn't feel like a normal fear response. Her heart was running too fast. Her skin was too hot. He bit her wrist. The venom entered her bloodstream at the radial artery, which is the fastest possible route to the rest of the body, and what it felt like was exactly what every account of it said it would feel like. Fire, liquid fire, moving up her arm and into her shoulder and down into her chest, converting everything it touched, attacking every nerve, ending simultaneously. The burning sensation has been described as the worst pain a human body can experience, and Bella Swan's body was experiencing it in full. She screamed. She did not decide to scream. The sound came out of her without any consultation. James stepped back to watch. He had done this before. He knew the progression. The burning, the thrashing, the gradual encroachment of paralysis as the venom spread, the body shutting down system by system as the conversion began. He knew how long it took. He had time. What he did not have and did not anticipate was what happened next. The venom spread from her wrist up her arm and hit her bloodstream, and her body temperature, which had already been spiking from the adrenaline, went somewhere else entirely. Not the elevated temperature of a fear response. Not the fever of illness. Something categorical and different. A heat that came from inside the cells, from below the level of organ function, from the level of the gene. The dormant shapeshifter gene, coiled in the double helix of every cell in her body since before she was born, encountered the venom's cellular assault and did not yield. It responded. The way a match responds to friction. The way a detonator responds to a signal it was always built to receive. Her body temperature hit 107 and kept climbing. James noticed. He was a tracker, and his senses were extraordinarily fine-tuned, and the heat coming off her body was wrong in a way that registered immediately. He took another step back. The burning smell of escalating wolf fever filled the small studio. He had never smelled that before. He had hunted humans, and he had fought vampires, and he had never in his existence encountered a human who smelled like that. Bella Swan was no longer processing the venom the way a human body does, because Bella Swan was no longer processing anything the way a human body does. The fever was burning the venom out, not eliminating it, but converting the conversion. The way a fire consumes a firebreak, the way one biological imperative overrides another when they meet at sufficient intensity. The venom had been trying to restructure her cells. The gene had been waiting for exactly that kind of cellular pressure. It took the assault as its ignition signal. The first phase is never graceful. The accounts from Sam's pack, the memories that would later pass through the pack mind like trauma acknowledged collectively, all describe the same thing, a body in total revolt. Bones that have been set in one configuration for 17 years finding a different configuration at speed, the musculature rewriting itself from the inside out, the spine extending, the skull restructuring, every tendon and ligament stretching past the point of tolerance and then past that point again. It is the worst pain of a different kind than the venom, not burning but breaking, a comprehensive mechanical catastrophe happening simultaneously in every part of the body. Bella screamed, and the scream changed pitch partway through. Her broken leg, the leg James had shattered at the tibia, repaired itself in the middle of the transformation, the bone resetting and fusing and reinforcing at a cellular speed that should have been impossible and was. The venom burn in her arm went quiet, as the cells it had been attacking were consumed into the restructuring. Her clothes tore. The mirror wall behind her cracked further under the pressure of something much larger than a 17-year-old girl pressing against it. When it was over there was a wolf in the ballet studio. Russet brown. Massive. Not the size of a large dog, but the size of a creature that had no business being inside a building, a head taller at the shoulder than any wolf that had ever lived in the wild. With paws the size of dinner plates, and a chest like a barrel and brown eyes that were still, unmistakably, Bella's. Still brown. Still Bella's exact shade of brown. She was in there, the human consciousness was present, horrified, overwhelmed by sensory input that made no sense yet, because the wolf's senses were so far beyond what she'd been working with for 17 years that the upgrade was disorienting in a way that felt like drowning. She could smell James. She could smell him the way no human had ever smelled a vampire. Not the sweetness. Not the surface-level biological signal that had always registered as beautiful and vaguely alarming, but the full predator threat reading that a wolf's nose is built to perform. It bypassed every aesthetic filter. What the wolf smelled was wrong and threat and kill, and the wolf's body responded to that reading with the kind of absolute certainty that does not require deliberation. James hesitated. He was a tracker, not a soldier. His gift was finding and following, and he had spent centuries developing that gift in relative safety because the things he hunted did not fight back with this kind of equipment. He had never seen a wolf phase. He had never been in a room with something that smelled like pure aggression and was looking at him with eyes that held no ambiguity whatsoever about its intentions. He hesitated for slightly less than 1 second. Wolf Bella did not hesitate at all. She killed James with the complete conviction of an animal, acting on instinct it did not know it had, until the moment it needed it. She did not experience it as a decision. The pack instinct, the protective, territorial, threat-eliminating drive that is hardwired into Quileute shapeshifters at the deepest biological level, took over with a totality that left no room for her human consciousness to intercede. It was over quickly. James was a tracker, and he was ancient, and he was skilled. But he was alone, and he was shocked, and the wolf in the ballet studio was none of those things. Edward Cullen and the Cullen family came through the studio doors at a run and stopped. There is a specific quality to the silence that falls in the moment after something impossible has happened, a quality that is not quiet at all, but is the absence of the particular noise that was happening before, which makes the silence feel louder than sound. That was the silence that fell in the ballet studio when the Cullens arrived. Alice stopped moving. Emmett, who had never stopped for anything in his existence, stopped. Jasper, whose every instinct was calibrated to the emotional tenor of every room he entered, read the room and went perfectly, carefully still. Edward stopped and looked at the wolf in the center of the studio, and the wolf looked back at him with Bella's eyes, and the silence went on for a long time. His horror was not at what she had done. What she had done to James was something Edward himself had been prepared to do, would have done without flinching, and the remains of James scattered across the ballet studio floor registered to him as a solved problem rather than a tragedy. His horror was at what she was, at the fact that he had never known, that she had been carrying this inside her for 17 years, and neither of them had ever had any indication, any warning, any moment of preparation. He had spent months convinced that the most dangerous thing in Bella Swan's life was his own nature. He had spent months meticulous about his control, about the distance he kept, about the way he touched her and breathed around her and managed the constant, specific effort of loving a human. He had never once looked at her and thought, there is something in there that is older than I am and stronger than I am and has been waiting for exactly the right pressure to emerge. He took a step toward her. The wolf that was Bella, took a step back. Her instincts smelled him, not the way her human nose had always smelled him, the cold and cedar and something indescribably Edward smell that she had memorized over the months of their relationship, that she associated with safety and love and the particular warmth of being near him despite his temperature. The wolf's nose processed him completely differently. What the wolf smelled was vampire. Sweet and wrong and predator and other. The full biological threat signal that every Quileute shapeshifter who had ever lived had been hardwired to register as a 5-alarm response. The aggression response didn't ask for her consent. It flooded her system and her body was backing away from him before her mind had finished forming the thought that this was Edward, and she loved him, and she did not want to run. She ran. She went through the studio wall rather than the door, because the door was where the Cullens were standing, and her wolf body was not going to move toward vampires. Not now. Not while the aggression response was running at full volume. She went through the exterior wall of the ballet studio and into the late afternoon Phoenix air, and she ran. And she was fast in a way that her human body had never been fast. Fast in a way that felt like flight, the ground covering itself under her paws at a rate that made no rational sense, and she did not stop. She ran north. She did not decide to run north. She ran north because north was where the cold was, and the rain was, and the trees were, and something in the wolf's navigational instinct, some deep geographic pull that she had not known she possessed, was pointing her toward the Olympic Peninsula the way a compass points toward magnetic north. She ran toward Forks because Forks was where the wolves were, though she did not know yet that she was thinking about wolves. Sam Yulee had been a wolf for 2 years, and an alpha for 18 months, and in that time he had handled situations that would have broken a person with a weaker sense of order. He had managed Paul's temper and Jared's impulsiveness and Embry's ongoing existential confusion about what he was and why. He had maintained the treaty with the Cullens through a proximity that his every instinct rejected and his sense of responsibility accepted. He had carried the weight of knowing that the history of his people included a tradition of warrior wolves, and that this tradition was not mythology, but biology, and that he was the current expression of it, and that this was not a burden he had chosen or could set down. He had never intercepted a wolf he didn't know. She came out of the trees on the south side of the Quileute patrol territory at a run that suggested she had been moving for a very long time without slowing down, which was one of the things a phased wolf could do that a human body could not. Sam was on patrol in wolf form when he picked up her scent, and the scent was wrong in a specific way. Wolf. Unmistakably wolf. Quileute lineage wolf in the particular biological signature that he'd learned to recognize in his own pack, but not any wolf he'd ever tracked. New, panicked running without direction, which was the most dangerous kind of running, because a wolf with no direction was a wolf that could go anywhere and do anything. He broadcast through the pack mind immediately, the mental equivalent of a shout, the image of her trail overlaid with the scent profile and his location, and the pack responded. Jared came from the east, Paul from the north. Quill and Embry converged from the tree line. They moved to intercept, not to engage, spreading into the loose encircling formation that Sam had drilled into them for exactly this kind of situation. A panicked wolf surrounded and contained before it could do damage to itself or anyone near it. Wolf Bella ran into the circle and stopped. She was larger than Sam had expected. Most new wolves phase at a size proportional to their physical build as a human, which meant the young men of La Push phased into large wolves, because they were large young men. Bella Swan, who was 5'4" and slight, and had never in her life occupied space the way the La Push boys did, phased into a wolf that was nearly Sam's size, which meant the alpha lineage gene that ran in the blood she'd inherited had expressed itself fully and without compromise. Sam registered this in the back of his mind and set it aside for later consideration. She was trembling. The overload of new senses was visible in the way her whole body was vibrating slightly, the way her ears were moving constantly, repositioning to track sounds she couldn't yet categorize. Her eyes were moving over all of them with a calculation that was partly wolf territorial and partly something else, the intelligence of a person trying to process a situation that had no available framework. Sam did not speak. In wolf form, speech is redundant. He showed her instead, opened his memories in the pack mind with the deliberate, careful precision he'd learned to use with new wolves, the same way you'd open a locked door slowly, rather than throwing it wide. His own first phase, the quality of that experience, the total body catastrophe of it, the way the world had been both annihilated and remade in the space of 30 seconds. He showed her the way back, not instructions but muscle memory, the felt experience of phasing back to human, transmitted through the pack mind as something she could use, rather than something she had to decode. The russet wolf stood still in the center of the circle and shook, and then the shaking changed quality, and then Bella Swan was on her hands and knees on the wet Washington ground. Human. Shivering in the autumn cold, with absolutely nothing on, because that is what happens to clothing during a phase. Emily brought a blanket from the truck they'd learned to keep near patrol routes. The women of the tribal community who knew the truth, the ones who cooked for the pack and kept the secrets and held the history, came out from the edge of the trees with the particular competence of people who have done this before, who have understood that the tradition of warrior wolves means the tradition of caring for them. Bella was wrapped and guided to a sitting position, and someone put a cup of something hot in her hands, and she held it without drinking it, staring at the ground, shaking with something that was not cold. Sam phased back, got dressed in the clothes he kept tied to his leg, crouched in front of her at eye level. He explained it the way he'd explained it to each of them in turn, Jared first, then Paul, then the others, with the directness that the situation required and the compassion that it also required. The Quileute Shapeshifter gene. The way it had been carried in the bloodline since Taha Aki, the first wolf chief. The one who had bound his spirit to a wolf's body in the time before Forks was a town, or the Olympic Peninsula had a name the colonizers recognized. The way it ran through the male line of the tribe's warrior families, dormant unless activated. The way it had been activating in the La Push boys for 2 years in response to the Cullen family's presence in Forks, vampire proximity as the biological ignition switch. Bella looked up at him when he said that. "It's not just the male line," she said. Her voice was hoarse. She'd been screaming. "No," Sam said, "it's not." He told her about her grandmother, about Charlie Swan's mother, who had been Quileute by blood and by lineage, and who had carried the gene without ever activating it because the conditions had never been right, because no vampire had ever come close enough, because the specific combination of biological stressors that the gene required had never converged in one moment the way they had in the ballet studio in Phoenix. He told her that this was not something anyone had known, that the tribal records of the gene focused on the male carriers because those were the ones who had activated it, that nobody had tracked the dormant female lineage with enough precision to find her. "Could I have been prepared?" she asked. The answer was no. He told her that. You cannot prepare a person to explode into a wolf. The preparation is irrelevant because the activation is involuntary, and the biology does not wait for readiness. All you can do is what they were doing now. Be present after, explain after, bring the new wolf into the community that understands what this is and knows how to hold it. She was quiet for a long time. The pack stood at a respectful distance in human form. Not pretending to be out of earshot, they couldn't pretend that anymore. Any of them. Because the pack mind had already given them the sketch of what she was carrying, the emotional profile of a girl who had just killed a vampire and run 3 states and was sitting in the cold Washington woods trying to understand what she was. They did not push. They waited. Then Sam explained the treaty. He explained it the way it needed to be explained, completely, without softening the implications. The Treaty of 1936, negotiated between Ephraim Black and Carlisle Cullen, established a line between Quileute land and Cullen territory that both parties agreed to observe. The Cullens did not hunt humans on or near Quileute lands. The Quileute wolves did not expose the Cullens' existence to the wider world. Each stayed in their territory. The treaty was the reason Forks had been relatively stable for 2 years despite the proximity of a vampire coven and a wolf pack who were, by every biological and historical measure, natural enemies. Bella was now, by biology and activation, on one side of that line. The Cullens were on the other. She heard this. She listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that Sam would come to recognize over the following weeks as distinctly Bella, the way she processed information with her whole face. The slight tightening around her eyes that meant she was holding something in rather than putting it out. She understood what he was telling her. She understood exactly what it meant for her relationship with Edward. She did not say anything about Edward. She did not say anything about refusing. She asked practical questions about phasing, about control, about the pack mind and what it meant and how it worked. She drank the cup of something hot. She let Emily talk to her about the tribe and the history and the tradition of the women who kept the knowledge while the wolves kept the line. She did not say that she could not accept Sam's framing of the treaty and what it required of her. She did not say it because she had already understood in the first minute of Sam's explanation. That saying it now would accomplish nothing and cost her everything. She was going to need these people. She was going to need Sam and the pack and the knowledge they had about what she was and how to function inside it. She was going to take everything they had to give her. She was also going to see Edward. She did not say so yet. The weeks after were a specific kind of exhausting that she had no name for. The exhaustion of a double life that requires you to maintain perfect coherence across 2 realities that share no vocabulary and cannot be allowed to contaminate each other. During the day, she went to school. She sat next to Angela in English and ate lunch with Jessica, and maintained the social architecture of a normal junior year in a small town where nothing interesting happened. She deflected questions about the trip to Phoenix with a story about a car accident and a broken leg that had healed faster than the doctors expected, which was true in a way that was more complicated than anything she wanted to explain. Charlie looked at her with the careful measuring look of a father who knows something has changed and is trying to determine whether it is his business to ask. She told him she was fine. He believed her with the particular trust of a man who'd spent her whole childhood respecting her tendency to manage her own interior life. At night she ran. The pack ran together in the early mornings and the late evenings, the perimeter of Quileute territory, the patrol routes that Sam had established over 2 years of practice, the loops through the dense forest of the Olympic Peninsula that covered miles in the time it would take a human to cover one. Running in wolf form was nothing like any physical sensation Bella had experienced as a human. It was not exercise. It was not effort. It was the body doing what it was built to do, moving through terrain with a grace and speed that felt less like running and more like the removal of the usual resistance between a creature and its environment. The ground cooperated. The trees fell away. The rain on her face was not the miserable cold rain of Forks, but something she moved through rather than something that fell on her. The pack mind was present in every run. She was learning to inhabit it. The shared telepathic space that linked every phased wolf simultaneously, the complete cognitive fusion that made privacy structurally impossible while shifted. In the early days, she mostly received rather than broadcast, the way a new arrival in a conversation hears the existing exchange before finding their own contribution. She heard Paul's running commentary, which was largely aggressive and occasionally funny, and never filtered, because Paul did not filter anything. She heard Jared's steadiness, the calm, practical competence that made him Sam's most reliable second. She heard Embry's ongoing curiosity about everything, the way his mind reached toward new information like a plant reaching toward light. She learned to manage what she broadcast. Mostly, you could not eliminate the broadcast. The pack mind was not selective and did not have an off switch. But you could, with practice. Manage which thoughts rose to the surface and which stayed in the deep water below. It was not lying, it was curation. It was the same skill she'd been practicing in human form since she was old enough to understand that some things she felt were better kept internal, just executed now on a neurological level that required active maintenance rather than simple social habit. She kept Edward in the deep water, not entirely, not perfectly. There were moments in the early runs when something he'd said would surface, a specific sentence, a particular memory. The way he'd looked at her in the hotel room in Phoenix the night before everything went wrong, and the pack mind would pick it up and she'd feel Paul's revulsion spike and Sam's attention sharpen, and she would push it back down fast. But she managed it well enough that Sam did not have explicit evidence. He had suspicion, which was sharper than evidence and more dangerous, but suspicion could not produce an alpha command the way evidence could. She thought about Edward constantly. The scent problem was its own specific misery that she had not anticipated with enough precision. She had understood, intellectually, that vampires smelled wrong to wolves. She had registered, before the phase, that there was something about the way the Cullens smelled that she'd always noticed without having a word for, not unpleasant, to human Bella, but marked. Present, a signal she'd been reading as beautiful because she was in love with the source. She had not understood what that signal would become once her wolf's nose was doing the reading. She drove past the Cullen house 3 days after returning to Forks. She told herself she only wanted to confirm they were back, that everyone was all right, that the events of Phoenix had settled. She rolled down the car window on instinct, the way she always had driving down that road. The human habit of wanting the cold outside air. The vampire smell from the Cullen property hit her wolf senses like a wall. Not a smell. A signal. The wolf's nose processed it at a speed and depth that bypassed every conscious filter and delivered a reading that was utterly unambiguous. Threat. Wrong. Predator. Other. Her hands went to the steering wheel before she decided to grip it. The aggression response flooded her system, the adrenaline, the elevated heart rate, the involuntary preparation of a body for a fight it was designed to win. She breathed through her mouth, which helped slightly, which was the biological equivalent of putting one finger in a dike that was about to fail. She drove past without stopping. She drove 3 more miles before her hands stopped shaking. The thing she could not manage, the piece of it that she could not find the workaround for, was that the smell was Edward's. The specific categorical wrongness that her wolf nose was producing was coming from the person she loved most, and the dissonance of that, the complete failure of her biology to distinguish between the threat reading and the love, was something she had no language for and no one to explain it to. The pack would understand the threat reading. They would not understand that she was fighting it. Edward was waiting at the tree line behind Charlie's house on a Thursday evening. He had stayed upwind deliberately. She would learn later that he'd spent the intervening week reading everything the Cullen family's library contained about Quileute wolves, the field notes Carlyle had kept since 1936, the careful natural history-style observations of a man who had always regarded the wolf treaty as a relationship rather than a boundary, the information about scent and response, and what proximity meant for a shifted wolf's nervous system. He had applied this information with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that the details were not incidental. The tree line, the upwind position, the 30 feet of distance that was not too far to be a statement and not close enough to trigger the aggression response she was still learning to manage. He stood at the tree line and waited. She came out of the house because she had been watching that tree line all evening, and she was constitutionally incapable of watching it any longer without going to it. She was in human form. She was always in human form for these moments. Now, the management of what she was becoming required the separation of the two states into different functions, and the function of this moment was human. She crossed the yard and stopped 10 feet from where he stood, and they looked at each other across the dark. "You came back," she said. "Of course I came back," he said, and his voice was the same. It was exactly the same as it had always been. That low, precise voice that she'd spent months memorizing, and something in her chest made a movement that had nothing to do with her wolf instincts and everything to do with what she was as a person. He did not step toward her. He knew better. His eyes were reading her face with the particular attention of someone who cannot read minds, and has had to develop alternate methods of knowing what the person they love is experiencing. She had always been opaque to him, her mind specifically closed to his gift in a way no other mind he'd ever encountered had been, and now there was a new layer of opacity. The interior life of her wolf that she was carrying in her body, even in human form, the slight background static of heightened senses and species-specific responses that ran underneath everything she did. "Your instincts," he said. "Not a question. Are present," she said. "Even now. It's quieter, in this form. But it's there. Does being near me? Yes," she said. "But I'm here anyway." He was quiet for a moment. The woods around them were making the usual sounds of a Washington evening in autumn. The rain, the wind through the firs, the distant call of something she could now identify without looking. "I don't want this to be something you fight every time we're together," he said. "I don't want to be something you have to endure." "Then don't make me talk about whether I can endure you," she said. "Talk to me about something else." He did. They talked for 2 hours, standing 30 feet apart in the dark behind her father's house. And it was the most they had ever talked. More than any conversation they'd had in the careful months of their relationship, when her mortality had made him careful about time and proximity, and what he allowed between them. They talked because physical closeness was partly unavailable to them now, and words filled the space that had always been occupied by the simpler, more immediate vocabulary of touch. She told him about the pack mind, the completeness of it, the way privacy was structurally impossible while phased. He listened without interrupting, which he was good at when the subject mattered. She told him about Sam's explanation of the treaty and what her position within it meant. She told him that Sam had issued expectations rather than orders so far, which would not last. He told her about the Cullen family's response, Carlyle's relief that she was alive, which had been total and immediate and genuine. Esme, who had looked at the situation with the particular calm of a woman who had rebuilt her life before and understood that the shape of things could change without the substance being lost. Emmett, who had said, in a moment that was either tactless or exactly right, depending on how you looked at it, that this was objectively one of the most interesting things that had ever happened, and he meant it as a compliment. Alice, he hesitated about Alice. She had lost Bella's future. The moment Bella phased, Alice's ability to track her had gone opaque. The wolf futures were invisible to Alice's gift, had always been invisible, a specific blind spot in her otherwise comprehensive foresight. Bella was now living entirely outside the range of what Alice could see. This was not something Alice was handling gracefully, because Alice found uncertainty destabilizing in proportion to how much she cared about the uncertain thing. And she cared about Bella very much. "And Rosalie?" Bella asked. Edward's expression did a complicated thing. "Rosalie looks at you," he said slowly, "and sees someone who has what she spent 80 years mourning the loss of. Life, warmth, a body that breathes and ages and..." He paused. "Except you don't age now," which is something she's still processing. Bella stood still for a moment with that. She had not thought through the immortality question with full precision yet. The days since Phoenix had been too immediate and overwhelming for long-term calculation. But it landed now, in the dark behind Charlie's house, standing 30 feet from Edward in the cold Washington air. As long as she kept phasing, the aging stopped. The cells froze at 17, at the biological moment of first transformation, and stayed there. She did not need to be turned. She did not need to die to stay with him. The relief of that was enormous and complicated, and the complication was this. She had always imagined becoming a vampire as becoming fully part of his world, matching him completely, being in the same category of existence. Being a wolf did not do that. She was in a parallel world, adjacent, close enough to touch through the dark, never quite the same geography. She was going to have to find a way to love the gap. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "I'll be here," he said. 2 days later, she phased for a training run, and Sam was in the pack mind, and he saw everything. The pack mind does not transmit information the way a file is transmitted, compressed, organized, received intact. It transmits experience. The memories of the treeline conversation came through with full sensory and emotional accompaniment. The sound of Edward's voice in the dark. The specific quality of the relief in her chest when he said, "Of course I came back." The 30 feet of distance she had maintained, and the effort that maintaining it had cost her. The 2 hours of words that had filled the space where touch used to live. The depth of what she felt for him transmitted not as an abstract fact, but as a felt reality. Every layer of it. The love, and the pain, and the specific. Exhausting courage it took to stand 30 feet from the person you loved and hold your body in check because your body had become something with its own opinions about what it would and would not tolerate. The pack felt it with her. All of them. Paul's response was immediate and physical. He nearly phased, the aggression spiking so fast that Sam had to reach through the pack mind and pull him back. Jared went quiet in the careful way of a person who is holding their reaction in. Embry's response was something more complicated, something closer to sorrow than anger. Seth Clearwater, the youngest, the one who had been on the edges of everything so far, felt the shape of what Bella was carrying and went very still with it. Sam's response was controlled. This was the worst possible outcome for Bella. Anger she could have argued with. Distress she could have navigated. Sam's cold, careful control was something else. The response of a person who had seen this coming and had prepared his position and was now going to deliver it without heat, which meant it was going to land without the weakness that heat introduces. He did not punish her. He was not cruel. He never punished and was never cruel, which was part of what made him effective and part of what made him maddening. He forbade her. Alpha command, direct and binding, she was not to have contact with the Cullens. Bella felt it land in her body the way she now understood alpha commands always landed. Not from outside, but from inside, the neurological compliance pressing in at the level of her wolf instincts, her body moving toward obedience before her conscious mind had fully processed that the command had been issued. This was the architecture of alpha authority. Not compulsion in the way a person can be compelled by external force, but a restructuring of the body's priority system, a rewriting of what the wolf self considered most important in real time. The impulse to comply was generated by her own nervous system, not by Sam's will acting on her from outside. He was not reaching in and turning a dial. He was triggering a mechanism that already existed in her, that was built into the biology of what she'd become. She was aware of all of this. She was aware that she was being compelled. She was aware that the mechanism doing the compelling was part of her own body. She was aware that there was nothing she could do about this while phased. She held all of that awareness and felt it for what it was, a violation that Sam intended as protection, that he experienced as responsible leadership, and that she experienced as a cage built from the inside of her own skull. She phased back to human as soon as the run ended. She stood in the wet woods and breathed human air, and felt the wolf instincts settle into the background static they always occupied in this form, still present, still running, but muted. In human form, the alpha command had no traction. Sam could not compel a wolf who was not phased. He had issued the command to her wolf self, and her wolf self had received it and would obey it every moment she was shifted. Her human self was another matter. She drove past the tree line behind Charlie's house at 9 o'clock that evening and left the car running and walked into the dark. Edward was already there. He had heard the car. She stopped at 25 feet. Still too close. Technically, the background static of her wolf senses registered his presence even in this form. The faint, sweet wrongness of vampire scent that she was getting better at breathing around, but closer than 30. She had been getting closer. She was going to keep getting closer. Sam knows, she said. I gathered, he said. He was upwind. He was always upwind. He issued a command. She let that sit for a second. It only works when I'm phased. Edward was quiet for a moment, reading her face with the attention that had replaced mind reading in his repertoire for her specifically. You're not phased now, he said. I'm not phased now, she confirmed. He looked at her with something she recognized from the early months of their relationship. The expression he had when he was calculating whether the thing he was about to do was the right thing and arriving, slightly reluctantly, at yes. This is going to create a problem with Sam, he said. It's already a problem with Sam, she said. I'm just managing which version of the problem I'm living in. The pack's fracture lines were already present, though not yet operative. Paul was entirely aligned with Sam's position. He had been from the first moment, and would be until something catastrophic changed his mind, which was Paul's nature. Jared was persuadable in the direction of Sam's authority because he trusted Sam's judgment more than he trusted any of his own instincts that ran counter to it. Embry was sitting in ambiguity, with the specific discomfort of someone who can see both sides of a thing and cannot determine which one he's supposed to be on. Seth Clearwater was quietly, privately, without saying anything to anyone, sympathetic to Bella. And Charlie Swan, in his kitchen on the other side of the dark, was watching the tree line through the window and deciding not to ask the question he was already 90% certain he knew the answer to. Because Charlie Swan was a man who had built his entire professional and personal life on the principle that some information, properly handled, did not require official acknowledgement. He was the chief of police and the father of a daughter who was spending a lot of time with the Quileute kids and coming home from late nights in the woods with wet boots and a kind of contained energy that reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own posture after a particularly significant case. He respected boundaries. He kept his counsel. He watched the tree line and said nothing, and loved his daughter in the particular way of a man who has decided that loving her means trusting her, and went to bed. The thing about Jacob Black was that he had always known something was coming for him. Not in the way that prophecy works, not in the way of visions or warnings or the particular foreknowledge that Alice Cullen carried like a second skin. Jacob had no gift for foresight, and no interest in developing one. What he had was the bone-deep awareness of a boy who had grown up in Billy Black's house, who had sat at his father's knee through enough tribal council meetings to understand that the history of La Push was not mythology, and that the stories about the warrior wolves were not stories. He had watched Sam Yulee come back from whatever had happened to him in the woods 2 years ago. Come back broader across the shoulders and quieter in a way that was not peace but containment. And he had understood without being told that Sam had crossed a threshold that existed in their bloodline, and that the threshold was real. He had been waiting for his own crossing, without having a name for what he was waiting for. What he had not been waiting for was Bella. He had not been waiting to find out that his best friend, the girl he had spent the past year learning to love in a way he did not yet have the vocabulary for, the girl he had rebuilt motorcycles with in his garage, and walked with on the beach at La Push and told things he had not told anyone else, had crossed the threshold before him. Had crossed it in Phoenix, in a ballet studio, in the middle of a vampire attack, without any preparation, and without him. Had been living on the other side of it for weeks, while he stayed on this side, sensing the distance she was keeping without being able to name its source. He had known something was wrong since she came back from Phoenix. She said car accident. He had accepted car accident with the particular acceptance of someone who does not believe the explanation and has decided that pressing for the truth would cost more than waiting for it. Bella had always kept things. She'd kept the Cullens from him for months before he'd understood what they were. She kept things carefully and quietly, and with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned that disclosure is a choice rather than a default. He knew her well enough to know this. He had accepted car accident and watched her and waited. The change in her was physical. She moved differently, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't spent a year memorizing the specific grammar of how she occupied space. But Jacob had spent a year doing exactly that, and he noticed. There was a new quality to the way she held herself, a baseline steadiness that hadn't been there before. As if her center of gravity had shifted slightly downward and stabilized. She was warmer to the touch when they sat together. He noticed that too, because he was running warm himself now and had chalked it up to the general escalation of whatever his body was doing, and then he noticed she was running warm in the same register and his chalk went somewhere else entirely. She was also not telling him something specific and significant and ongoing. He could feel the shape of the not telling the way you can feel the shape of an object under a sheet without being able to identify it. Something was there. She was managing it carefully. She was managing him. He had been managing his own situation without her, which was the part that hurt most when he looked at it directly. The body changes had been escalating for weeks. The temperature, the muscle mass, the hair-trigger quality of his temper that had never been this volatile before, the way he'd nearly phased twice in the past week, without understanding what nearly phasing meant, because he didn't have a word for it yet. He was alone with it. Sam would have helped him, but approaching Sam felt like conceding something he wasn't ready to concede, like walking voluntarily toward the threshold he'd been circling for a year. And Bella was the person he'd have told. Except Bella was not telling him something, and the symmetry of that was not lost on him. The phase came on a Tuesday morning before school. He was in the garage. He had been in the garage since 5 a.m. because sleeping was increasingly difficult and working on the motorcycle was the closest thing to calm he had access to, and he was thinking about Bella in the specific circular way that he'd been thinking about her for days. The new quality to her movement, the warmth of her skin, the shape of the thing she wasn't telling him. And the frustration of all of it converged with something else, something below the level of thought. The general biological pressure that had been building for weeks, and the threshold arrived without announcement. The phase was rough and terrifying, and he was alone, which was the worst possible circumstance for a first transformation that had no preparation behind it. Alone meant no pack mind to receive him. Alone meant no experienced wolf to show him the way back. Alone meant 30 seconds of total biological catastrophe happening to him in complete isolation. The bones, the restructuring, the comprehensive physical overhaul of a body that had been human for 16 years, with nothing to anchor him except his own consciousness, which was not having a great morning to begin with. He destroyed most of what was left of the motorcycle before he found his way back to human. He sat on the garage floor for a long time. Then he called Sam. Sam sent Bella. He had reasons, and they were good reasons, and Bella understood them and resented them and went anyway, because Jacob was in the garage and Jacob needed her, and the reasons Sam had for sending her were the same reasons Jacob needed her specifically, and not any of the others. She was his best friend. She was the wolf he trusted before he trusted any of the pack. She was the person who could walk into that garage and say, "I know what just happened to you," and have it mean something other than a stranger's explanation. What Sam had not fully calculated, or had calculated and accepted as an acceptable cost, was that sending Bella to bring Jacob into the pack mind for the first time meant that Jacob's first experience of the pack mind would include everything Bella had been keeping in the deep water. She drove to Billy's house and parked, and went around to the garage and found Jacob sitting on the floor with the remains of the motorcycle around him and an expression that she recognized from the inside. She had worn it herself on the ground in the Washington woods while Emily brought a blanket, and someone pressed a cup of something hot into her hands. "Hey," she said. He looked up at her and the expression shifted, and she saw the moment he put certain things together, her warmth, her steadiness, the shape of the not telling, and arrived at the truth before she said anything. "How long?" he said. "Since Phoenix," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The car accident. There was no car accident. He absorbed this with the stillness of someone who is deciding how angry to be and whether now is the time for it. He decided it wasn't. "You should have told me." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." He accepted this in the way he accepted most things from her, not entirely, not permanently, but for now. He let her explain. She told him everything she could, the gene, the lineage, the biology of it, the way the pack worked and what the pack mind was and what it meant to have Sam as alpha. She told him about the treaty and the pack's function and the history that the tribal council carried. She told him everything except Edward. Because Edward was in the deep water, and she had learned to keep Edward in the deep water, and she told herself she would tell Jacob about Edward separately, in human form, in a conversation that was just the two of them and not mediated by the pack mind's unfiltered transmission. She did not get the chance. She phased to run alongside him for his first shift, the pack protocol for a new wolf, the stabilizing presence of an experienced wolf in the pack mind to anchor the new arrival through the disorientation of the first linked run. She phased and the pack mind opened between them immediately, the way it always did when two wolves shifted in proximity, the automatic cognitive fusion that had no off switch and no courtesy filter. And Jacob entered the pack mind. The experience of entering the pack mind for the first time has been described by every member of Sam's pack in the same terms: vertiginous, overwhelming. The sudden expansion of consciousness into a space that is larger than the individual mind can immediately accommodate. The other wolves are already present in that space. Their thoughts, their memories, their sensory feeds, their emotional states, and the new arrival receives all of it simultaneously before they have time to orient. Jacob received all of it simultaneously. He received Paul's running territorial aggression. He received Jared's steady competence. He received Embry's ongoing curiosity. He received Sam's calm, authoritative presence at the center of everything, the organizing principle around which the rest of the pack mind oriented itself. And he received Bella, all of her. The pack mind does not organize or compress or select. It transmits experience with full sensory and emotional fidelity. Bella had been managing what rose to the surface of her broadcasts with considerable skill and consistent effort. But the management was imperfect. It had always been imperfect, and in the moments of lowered guard, in the early morning runs and the late evenings when exhaustion made curation difficult, things had risen. Memories, feelings, the specific texture of what she carried. Jacob received all of it in a single data transmission that took no time at all. He received the treeline conversations, Edward upwind, 30 feet away, the dark behind Charlie's house, the 2 hours of words filling the space where touch used to live. He received the specific quality of the relief in her chest when Edward said, "Of course I came back." He received the daily effort of driving past the Cullen house with the window rolled up, of breathing through her mouth when the vampire scent hit her wolf nose, of holding her body in check when every wolf instinct was telling her to run or fight, and she was choosing to stand still. He received the love itself, not as an abstract fact, not as a piece of information she was communicating, but as a lived experience, with full emotional accompaniment, the way the pack mind transmitted everything. He felt her love for Edward Cullen with the same weight that she felt it. This was the specific catastrophe of it. He did not learn that Bella loved a vampire the way a person learns news, from a distance, with time to process, with the buffer of the gap between knowing about something and feeling it. He learned it from the inside. He felt it with the sensory completeness of a pack mind transmission, and he could not look away from it, because the pack mind does not offer that option. Not in the first moment of connection before a wolf has learned the management skills that Bella had spent weeks developing. He felt her love for Edward, and he felt his own love for Bella in the same moment, and the collision of those two things was something he had no framework for. He phased back. He was on the ground in the woods outside Billy's house, and Bella phased back too, because she knew immediately what had happened. Had felt the moment of transmission through the pack mind from the other side, the way it felt to have the deep water surface all at once, without warning. She phased back to human, and stood in the wet ferns, and looked at him, and there was nothing to say, because everything had already been said by the pack mind with a completeness that no conversation could match. Jacob was quiet for a long time. The first thing he did was grieve. He grieved in the specific way of someone who has lost something they never technically had, the clean. Complete grief of a hope that was never declared and is now definitively foreclosed. He had never told Bella that he loved her. He had never acted on it, never given it a name, never done anything except hold it carefully in the private interior of his human consciousness where no pack mind could reach it. He had been waiting for the right moment, which is another way of saying he had been waiting for courage, and the waiting had cost him the chance because the pack mind had transmitted the truth of her feelings to him before he could get to his own. He sat on the wet ground in the woods and felt the full weight of it, and did not try to manage it, because there was no one watching in this form and he was 16, and it hurt. Then he got angry. The anger came because it was easier than the grief, because grief is a passive state, and anger requires action, and Jacob Black was not built for passivity. Not at 16 with a body that was now running wolf temperature and wolf adrenaline and the hair-trigger biochemistry of a shapeshifter who had not yet learned Sam's particular discipline of control. The anger had the same quality as his love, complete, unfiltered, expressed at full volume because he had no practice yet at keeping things in the deep water. He converted his love into possessiveness, because that was the conversion that felt most like action. Bella should be with someone alive. Someone warm. Someone who didn't require her to breathe through her mouth and stand 30 feet away and fight her own body every moment of their proximity. Someone who was actually from here, from this land, from this tradition. Someone who was Quileute. Someone who understood from the inside what she was now and what it meant. Someone who made biological sense. The argument built in him with the force of something that has been looking for a vessel, because the argument was not only his. Sam had been making the same argument in different terms since the moment he'd read Bella's Pac-Mind broadcasts and issued the Alpha command. Paul made it with pure aggression. Jared made it with quiet pragmatism. The Pack's consensus was not a conspiracy against Bella, it was a genuine collectively held position that her relationship with Edward was not just a treaty violation, but a form of self-harm. That she was choosing, every day, to love something that her own biology identified as a threat. Jacob went to Sam. He did not go in grief. He went in anger, because anger was the vocabulary he had for this, and Sam received him with the particular patience of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared his position in advance. Sam listened to Jacob's version of events, the Pac-Mind transmission, the depth of what Bella was carrying for Edward, the weeks of secret meetings at the tree line, and his expression did not change, because Sam had already known most of this and had been managing it with the Alpha command that was not. He was now acknowledging. Working as well as he'd hoped. She's still seeing him, Jacob said. In human form, Sam said. The command doesn't reach her in human form. Then issue it in human form. Sam was quiet for a moment. The limitation he was running against was one he could not fully resolve. Alpha command required phasing to transmit. A human form instruction from Sam was exactly as binding as an instruction from any other person. which was to say it was binding only insofar as Bella chose to honor it. And Bella had demonstrated a very clear hierarchy of what she chose to honor. "I'm aware of the situation," Sam said. "She's meeting a leech in the dark behind Charlie's house," Jacob said. "Every night. The whole pack knows it." "I know. Then what are we doing about it?" The answer Sam gave was not the answer Jacob wanted, which was immediate and forceful intervention. Sam's answer was the answer of a man who understood that Bella was not a subordinate who could be managed by authority alone, that she was something more complicated than that, something his alpha authority was not entirely equipped to handle, and that managing her badly would cost him more than managing her carefully. He was watching. He was thinking. He was waiting for the situation to develop to a point where the correct response was clear. Jacob left the conversation with the anger still fully intact and nowhere productive to put it, which is the most dangerous condition a 16-year-old wolf can be in. He put it in Edward. The confrontation between Jacob and Edward happened at the border of Cullen territory, which was technically the wrong location for both of them and the right location for the specific drama they were enacting. Jacob had tracked Edward's scent to the tree line near the border. Edward had been walking the perimeter, which was something he did when he was thinking, which was something Bella had told Jacob once without understanding that the information would be filed and used. And he stepped out of the tree line with the particular quality of presence that a newly phased wolf develops before they've learned the management of it. Large, warm, radiating aggression like a heat source. Edward stopped and looked at him with the patient, reading expression that was his default around Jacob, the expression of a man who can hear every thought in a room and is choosing to respond to the person rather than the interior monologue. "Jacob," he said. "She told me," Jacob said. "Or the pack mind told me." "Same thing. I know. You know what you're doing to her. It was not a question. You know what it costs her to be near you. You know what she has to fight every time you're in the same space. You know all of that, and you keep showing up at her tree line every night." "She asked me to," Edward said. "She doesn't get to make that call clearly," Jacob said. "Her biology is compromised. She's fighting her own instincts every second she spends with you, and you know it, and you keep going back." Edward was quiet for a moment, reading Jacob's face with the attention he brought to anything he could not read directly. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is Bella making a choice under difficult circumstances. That is different from Bella being unable to choose. She's a wolf," Jacob said. "She's Quileute. She belongs on this side of the line. She belongs," Edward said, with a precision that was not heat but was close to it, "where she decides to belong." The conversation deteriorated from there with the efficiency of two people who are not actually disagreeing about facts and are therefore disagreeing about everything else. Jacob's anger had nowhere to go except forward, and Edward's tactical intelligence was keeping him from giving it anywhere productive to land, which was the correct strategy and also the most infuriating possible response to someone who came looking for a fight. They did not touch each other. They came close. Jacob's hands were shaking with the effort of holding the phase back. The aggression response to vampire proximity at this range was running at a volume that made conversation a significant act of will, and Edward was watching the shaking hands with the expression of a man who understood exactly what it meant and was staying very carefully still. Bella arrived between them. She had been walking from Charlie's house toward the Cullen border for reasons she had not articulated to herself with full honesty, driven by the same bone-deep awareness of what was happening that had pulled her out of the hotel room in Phoenix and toward a ballet studio. She arrived to find them 8 feet apart in the tree line and stopped and looked at both of them. "No," she said. Neither of them said anything. "I'm not going to be the thing you fight over," she said. "I'm not a territory. I'm not a question that gets answered by whoever wins this conversation. I have already made my decisions, and they are mine, and I am not renegotiating them in the middle of the woods." She looked at Jacob. "I love you," she said. "You are my brother and my pack, and I would have told you about Edward if I'd had the chance to do it the right way. I'm sorry you found out the way you did." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he held still. She looked at Edward. "Go home," she said. Edward looked at her for a moment. Then he went. She turned back to Jacob, and the anger in him was still present, but it had shifted register slightly. From the hot, immediate aggression of the confrontation to something older and more painful underneath. She recognized the underneath. She had spent weeks managing her own version of it. "It's not going to change," she said, not unkindly. As directly as she could. "I know," he said. Which was the truest thing either of them said to each other that evening, and the hardest. Alice's visions started arriving with more urgency in the weeks that followed, which was the universe's timing and not anyone's plan. She could not see wolves. Wolf futures were opaque to her gift in the specific way that Bella's future had always been opaque to her, a blind spot in her otherwise comprehensive foresight, an area of darkness that she had learned to navigate around but could not see into directly. What she could see was Seattle. What she could see was the human population of Seattle and the way it was declining in the specific patterns she had learned to recognize over decades of watching vampire activity near populated areas. The missing persons, the unexplained deaths, the cluster of incidents in neighborhoods near the waterfront that had no satisfying human explanation and a very clear supernatural one. Newborns, a large number of them, operating without discipline or direction that Alice could detect, moving through Seattle with the chaotic hunger of vampires who had been turned recently and had not yet developed the control that age brings. Newborn vampires are the most dangerous creatures in the Twilight world in the short term, stronger than older vampires, driven by a hunger so consuming it overrides rational decision-making, with none of the strategic capability that comes with centuries of practice. An army of them is not a precision weapon. It is a flood. She brought this to Carlisle first, the way she always brought the difficult things to Carlisle, because Carlisle had the longest view of any of them and the steadiest response to information that required a long view to process without panic. Carlisle looked at what she'd seen and asked the question that was not rhetorical: who was building it and why? The why was not obscure. Victoria had been in the background of every Cullen calculation since Phoenix, since the ballet studio, since the night a russet wolf had solved the James problem in a way that none of them had anticipated, which had left Victoria without her mate and with a specific, targeted grievance against the person responsible. Against Bella. Edward knew before Carlisle finished the sentence. He had been tracking Victoria's absence, the absence of her scent from the perimeter, the careful, deliberate avoidance of Quileute territory and Cullen territory alike, the patience of a creature who had decided that the direct approach had already failed and was building something different. He had known she was out there. He had been watching for the shape of what she was building. Alice's visions gave the shape a name. Victoria was patient. This was the most important thing about her as an adversary and the most dangerous. She was not chaotic. She was not impulsive. James had been the tracker and the hunter, and she had been the one who survived because she had always known when to run and how long to stay gone and what to build while she was away. She had watched what happened in Phoenix, and she had understood it with a cold strategic clarity. The Cullens and the wolves were natural enemies. The treaty kept them separate. A vampire army coordinated from outside both territories, built in a city far enough from the Quileute patrol routes to avoid detection, could arrive at Forks before either group was prepared. And neither group would cooperate with the other to stop it, because the treaty would not allow that cooperation. She had built her army on the assumption that the line between vampires and wolves would hold. This was her miscalculation. It was a reasonable miscalculation, based on a century of the line holding. It did not account for Bella, who was standing on both sides of the line simultaneously and had been since Phoenix. Edward processed all of this in the space of Alice's briefing and arrived at the conclusion that he did not want to arrive at. He was going to have to tell Bella. He was going to have to tell Bella that Victoria had built an army specifically to kill her, and that the army was large enough that the Cullens could not handle it alone, and that handling it was not going to be possible without the cooperation of the wolves, and that the cooperation of the wolves was not something Sam Yulee was going to provide voluntarily. He was going to have to ask Bella to involve herself in a war that was, technically, his family's consequence. Bella was not going to have a problem with that. She was going to have the opposite of a problem with it. The problem was going to be Sam. She went to the Cullen house for the first time since she had phased. This was an act of will that required a specific kind of preparation, not emotional preparation. She had been managing the emotional reality of her situation for weeks, but physical preparation. She drove to the edge of Cullen territory and sat in her truck with the windows up for 5 minutes, breathing deliberately, the controlled in through the nose, out through the mouth pattern she had been practicing since the first run when Sam had noticed her technique and said, without particular warmth, that it was the correct instinct applied with reasonable precision. She was managing the aggression response. She was telling her wolf self, with the specific repetition that the wolf self responded to, that the threat signal it was reading from the property ahead was known and classified and not to be acted upon. She got out of the truck. She walked to the front door. She knocked, which she had never done before. She had always been let in, always been expected. Always arrived in the context of a relationship that made knocking redundant. Knocking felt right now. Knocking acknowledged that she was on the other side of a threshold that had not existed between her and this house before. Carlyle opened the door. He looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face in hospitals and in difficult conversations, and in the moments when someone he loved was hurting, and he understood the hurt clearly enough to hold it without flinching. He was not reading her wolf nature with discomfort. He was not reading it as a threat or a complication or a political problem. He was reading it as a fact about a person he cared about, the way he read any fact about any person he cared about, with attention, with compassion, and with the long view that came from having been alive for 360 years. "Bella," he said, and stepped back from the door to let her in. She breathed through her mouth. The house smelled overwhelmingly of vampires, not just Edward, but all of them. The collective scent of 8 vampires who had lived in this space for years, and whose presence was embedded in every surface and fiber of it. Her wolf senses read it as maximum threat signal, and she was reading that reading back to herself and overriding it with a deliberateness that left her slightly lightheaded. She stood just inside the door and did not go further, and Carlyle did not suggest that she should. He told her what Alice had seen. He told her about Seattle and the newborns, and the pattern that pointed unambiguously toward Victoria. He told her the army's estimated size, larger than the Cullens had dealt with before in a direct confrontation, large enough that the tactical math without additional support produced outcomes that none of them found acceptable. She told him what the pack would and would not do. She told him about Sam's position on the treaty and what the century of precedent behind that position looked like from the inside. She told him that Sam's reasoning was not irrational, that it was, in fact, a coherent strategic position based on a genuine understanding of what the treaty was for and what happened when the lines it maintained began to blur. She told him that she did not agree with Sam's position, and that she was going to have to do something about that, but that she was not going to pretend his reasoning was stupid, because it wasn't. Carlyle listened to all of this with the particular quality of attention that she associated with him specifically. The attention of someone who has been listening to difficult truths for 360 years and has developed a genuine capacity for receiving them without deflecting. He did not try to solve Sam for her. He did not offer strategies for managing the pack's position. He simply received the information and sat with it, and when she was finished he said, "What do you need from us?" She thought about it. "Time," she said, "and the exact count of what Alice can see." He gave her both. Sam called the pack meeting on a Thursday evening at the bonfire site on Quileute land, the traditional gathering place for decisions that required the whole community's attention. He called it in human form, which was the form for formal deliberation. The wolf form was for action, for patrol, for the pack mind's collective intelligence in the field. Human form was for argument, for history, for the particular democracy of the pack structure that Sam ran as something closer to a council than a dictatorship, even when his authority was absolute. The fire was high. The whole pack was present. Sam and Paul and Jared and Embry and Quill and Seth and Bella and Jacob, who had been integrated into the pack in the weeks since his first phase, with the efficiency that the pack structure required of a new wolf, and the difficulty that Jacob's specific personality required of everyone around him. He was learning control. He was not there yet. Sam laid out the situation. Victoria's army in Seattle, Alice's visions, the Cullen family's assessment of the threat. He laid it out completely and accurately, without editorializing, because Sam was fair in his information delivery even when his conclusions were not fair to everyone in the room. He presented the facts as facts. Then he presented his position. The army was a vampire problem. It had been created by vampires, in response to something that had happened between vampires, in a city well outside Quileute territory. The pack's obligation under the treaty was to the protection of their land and their people, not to the resolution of conflicts between vampire factions, and not to the defense of a coven that had, by harboring Bella in her current situation, already complicated the treaty beyond the terms the original signatories had agreed to. The pack's job was to hold the line at La Push. If Victoria's army crossed into Quileute territory after the Cullens had been defeated, the pack would engage. Until then, the pack stayed home. Paul was nodding before Sam finished. Jared's expression was the careful neutrality of a man who agreed with the reasoning and was waiting to see if anyone could challenge it successfully. Quill and Embry exchanged a look that said this was not the meeting either of them had expected to find themselves in when they'd gotten up this morning. Seth Clearwater was looking at Bella. Jacob was looking at the fire. Bella stood up. She did not make the emotional argument. She had been thinking about this for 3 days, since Carlisle's briefing, and she had arrived at the correct register for this specific audience. Sam responded to logic. The pack respected demonstrated reasoning. She was going to give them that. She laid out the tactical reality without ornamentation. Victoria's army was not going to stop at the Cullen property. Newborns with no discipline and no objective beyond the initial target do not stop moving when the initial target is eliminated. They keep moving, following hunger, following the scent of population. Forks was populated. La Push was populated. If the Cullens were overwhelmed by the size of the army, the surviving newborns would be moving through Quileute territory within hours. Sam's plan to engage when the army crossed the line was a plan to fight a depleted army at a disadvantage, rather than fighting it at full strength alongside the Cullens now. The math did not improve by waiting. The pack was quiet when she finished. Sam looked at her for a long moment. She saw him processing it, the tactical logic, which was sound, weighed against the principle, which was also sound, which was the specific bind he was in. He was not dismissing her argument. He was measuring it against a framework she could not fully appreciate from the outside, the framework of a man who had been the only thing standing between his community and disaster for 2 years, and who understood that the framework required maintenance to function. The Cullens created this threat, he said. By not letting James kill me, Bella said. Yes, by becoming involved with a member of this pack, he said, by creating a situation that gave Victoria a target. The treaty exists to prevent exactly this kind of entanglement. The treaty didn't prevent it, she said, because the situation was new. Because nobody who wrote the treaty in 1936 anticipated that a human carrying the dormant gene would be living in Forks and dating a Cullen and then phasing in the middle of a vampire attack. She let that sit. The treaty was written for a world that doesn't exist anymore. This world is the one we're actually in. Sam's expression did not change. He was very good at not letting his expression change. The pack will not engage alongside the Cullens, he said. Alpha command, direct and binding. Bella felt it land. She felt it the way she always felt it. From the inside, the neurological compliance pressing in at the level of her wolf instincts. Her body orienting toward obedience before her conscious mind had finished processing that the command had been issued. The mechanism was familiar to her now. She had felt it before. She knew its texture. The specific quality of a wolf's will bending toward the alpha's directive, the way it pressed and pressed until compliance was the path of least resistance. It pressed. It did not complete. The non-completion was not dramatic. It was not a burst of power or a visible resistance or anything that the rest of the pack could see from the outside. It was internal and quiet and absolute, the sensation of a command reaching for a mechanism that was not there to receive it. Like a key in a lock that is not the lock it was cut for. The command arrived and found no purchase and dissipated. And Bella stood in the firelight and understood what this meant one layer at a time. Alpha cannot command Alpha. This was the lore foundation, the biological reality that Jacob had been moving towards since his first phase, that Sam had been managing around without acknowledging, that the tribal records described in terms of bloodline and succession, and the particular independence of an alpha lineage wolf who had chosen deference without biological subordination. Jacob was an alpha lineage wolf who had been deferring to Sam because the deference was a choice rather than a compulsion. When he was ready to stop choosing it, Sam's commands would stop completing in him. Bella was an alpha lineage wolf. She understood this now with the clarity of having just experienced it, the intensity of her first phase. The self-directed nature of what she'd done to James. The way the pack mind had extended to receive her rather than absorbing her into the existing structure. The size of the wolf she'd become, disproportionate to her human frame, a size that expressed the alpha gene's full potential rather than a beta lineage wolf's more modest dimensions. Sam's command had not completed. She was standing in the firelight and she was still herself, entirely, with no compliance pressing her will in any direction. She looked at Sam across the fire. His expression had changed. He read what had happened with the speed of a man who knew the lore as well as she now did, who had been watching her carefully enough to have arrived at the same question she'd just answered empirically. His expression was not anger. It was something more complicated than anger. the expression of a man whose authority has just reached its structural limit and who is processing the implications of that in real time. She did not make a speech about it. She did not perform the moment. She said, "I'm going to go help the Cullens. I'm not going to command anyone else to come with me. That's their decision," she phased. Her own pack mind closed, the link to Sam's pack severed with a clean final quality that felt like a door closing rather than a lock breaking. Her own space opened, the Alpha's independent mind, not linked to anyone yet. Sam's link to her was gone. She was a lone Alpha standing in wolf form in the firelight at the Quileute bonfire site. And the fire was still high, and the pack was still watching, and the silence lasted for exactly as long as it took Seth Clearwater to stand up. Seth Clearwater stood up. He was the youngest of them, 17 and slight and open-faced, with the quality of someone who leads by going first because the moral calculus seems obvious to him even when it's complicated for everyone else. He stood up and looked at Sam, and the look was not defiance. It was the look of someone saying, "I love you and I disagree with you, and both of those are going to be true at the same time from now on." He phased. His link to Sam's pack severed. His link to Bella's mind opened. She felt him arrive in her pack mind with the same vertiginous quality of connection she'd first felt when Sam's wolves had found her in the woods after Phoenix, but smaller and quieter, and very specifically Seth. Jacob had not moved. He was still looking at the fire. The calculation happening in him was visible in the quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of a person who has already decided, but the stillness of a person who is in the last seconds of deciding and knows that the next movement will be permanent. He had come into the pack mind and received Bella in full. He had carried that for weeks, the grief and the anger and the conversion of grief into territorial aggression and the slow, grinding process of learning that the aggression was not going to resolve anything. He had confronted Edward at the tree line and come back unchanged. He had made his argument to Sam and been given Sam's full endorsement, and the endorsement had not made him feel better, because the thing underneath the argument was not a political position. It was love for Bella. It was the specific love of a boy for his best friend who was walking towards something dangerous and alone. He could disagree with her choice and still walk beside her. He had known this for a while. He had been refusing to know it. He stood up. He phased. His alpha lineage severed from Sam's command with the same clean finality that Bella's had. He arrived in her pack mind, and she felt him there. Big, warm, specifically Jacob. Still angry and still grieving and choosing to come anyway. Two others followed. Quill and Embry, who had been sitting with their ambivalence for weeks and had arrived, in the specific pressure of this moment, at the position their ambivalence had been pointing toward all along. Sam watched 4 members of his pack choose a direction he had commanded them not to take. His expression was controlled in the way of someone absorbing a significant thing without allowing it to change their posture. He was not finished. He was not broken. He was a man whose authority had just been tested by its structural limit, and who was going to spend the next several days deciding what he thought about that. He said nothing. Bella, Wolf Bella, the russet alpha, standing in her own pack mind with Seth and Jacob and Quill and Embry linked to her for the first time, turned away from the fire and walked into the dark toward the Cullen side of the line, and the wolves who had chosen her followed, and the fire burned down behind them. The night before the battle they met in the clearing between territories, unmarked ground. Neither Cullen property nor Quileute land, the woods that belonged to both, and therefore neither. Bella's wolves and the Cullen family, in the same space for the first time, with no treaty line between them and no authority telling them to maintain distance. The discomfort was mutual and visible, and none of them were pretending otherwise, which was the right way to handle it. The Cullens were controlling the instinctive response to wolf proximity, the territorial species red that was as hardwired into them as the aggression response was hardwired into the wolves. The wolves were managing the vampire scent overload with the deliberate breathing techniques that Bella had been teaching the others since Seth joined her pack. Because Seth had asked directly, and she had answered directly, and the others had listened. Edward stood next to Bella at the center of the clearing. She was in human form. She was standing close enough to him that the aggression response was present in her wolf senses, and she was managing it with the control she'd been building for weeks, which was better than it had been and not yet perfect. Which was the honest assessment of where they were. He did not keep his distance in the careful way he usually kept it. He stood next to her the way you stand next to someone you are fighting alongside tomorrow, close enough for the shoulder proximity to mean something. Carlisle and Bella ran the strategy. It was her plan as much as his. She knew wolf capabilities with the specificity of someone living them, and Cullen capabilities with the specificity of someone who had spent a year paying close attention to a family she loved, and she could calculate the tactical fit between them in a way that no one else present could. The Cullen's speed and precision paired with the wolves' raw power and the pack coordination that the pack mind enabled in ways no vampire unit could replicate, each compensating for the other's vulnerabilities. The wolves could absorb punishment that would incapacitate a vampire. The Cullens could execute with precision that the wolves' instinct-heavy fighting style lacked individually. She laid it out. Everyone listened. There were questions. She answered them. Jasper, who had a century of military experience that none of the others could match, and who had been listening to the plan with the focused attention of someone running tactical simulations in real time, said, "That works," which was the most Jasper would ever say and was everything she needed from him. When the strategy was finished and the positions had been assigned and the questions had been answered, the clearing went quiet in the way of people who understand what morning means and are spending the last hours of the night being present with the weight of it. Bella and Edward walked away from the group into the trees. She did not plan what she was going to say. She had learned, in the months since Phoenix, that planning what to say to Edward was largely pointless because the conversation always went somewhere she hadn't planned for, and the unplanned conversations were the ones that actually held what needed to be said. "I'm not afraid," she told him. It was true in the specific way that the truth is sometimes surprising. "I know," he said. He was looking at her with the reading expression, the one that had replaced mind reading in his repertoire for her specifically. "I've been watching you not be afraid for weeks. It's one of the more extraordinary things I've seen. I'm a wolf," she said. "Fear is apparently optional equipment." He smiled, which was the expression she had spent a year memorizing and still wasn't done with. He reached out and took her hand and she let him, managing the aggression response with the ease that weeks of practice had built. Not gone, never entirely gone, but workable. Her hands were warm and his were cold, and the temperature differential was the same as it had always been and the same as it would always be, and she had stopped trying to resolve it and started simply feeling it. "I don't need you to protect me tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "That's new," she said. "For you." He was quiet for a moment. "It's different," he said carefully. "I thought for a long time that protecting you was the primary thing I had to offer. That it was. The function I served in your life. And you were human, and you were breakable, and the function mattered." He looked at their hands. "You are not breakable now. You have not been breakable since Phoenix, and I've been recalibrating what it means to love someone who doesn't need what I always thought I was providing." "What have you arrived at?" she asked. "Equality," he said. "I've arrived at the fact that I'm in love with my equal, and that I have absolutely no experience with that, and that it is the most terrifying and the most right thing that has ever happened to me." She held on to his hand, and they stood in the dark between the territories and let that sit, and in the morning they were going to go fight a war, and the morning was not yet. And for now there was just the cold and the dark and the specific gravity of two people who had fought very hard to stand in the same space together. The morning came in the way that mornings come before significant things. Quietly, without announcement, the light arriving through the fir trees in the slow gray increments of a Washington dawn that does not commit to brightness so much as it commits to the gradual elimination of dark. The clearing between the territories was already occupied by the time the light was strong enough to read faces. The Cullen family had not slept, because they did not sleep. Bella's wolves had not slept either, though for different reasons the pre-battle biochemistry of a phased wolf is not compatible with rest. The adrenaline running at a low continuous hum that keeps every sense at maximum resolution and makes stillness feel like a strategy rather than a state. They had spent the last hours of the night in their respective clusters at the clearing's edge, close enough for the strategy to hold, and far enough for the biological discomfort of proximity to remain manageable. Bella had moved between them twice. Once to check the wolves' positions and confirm that Seth and Jacob had the flank assignments correct. Once to stand with Carlisle at the clearing center and go through the timing one more time. Both times she had felt the dual register of her existence with particular clarity. The wolf senses reading the Cullen family as threat signal, and the human consciousness overriding that reading with the accumulated weight of everything she knew about these people, everything they had chosen to be to her, everything they were about to do together. Carlisle had looked at her on her second pass and said, "Are you ready?" with the specific quality of question that was not asking about preparation. She had said yes, which was the honest answer. Edward had watched her move through the clearing from his position at the east flank and had not said anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not been said in the dark between the territories the night before. He had arrived at equality, and she had let him arrive there. And what equality looked like in the daylight of this morning was two people in their separate positions, doing the separate things they were each built to do. She phased at the clearing's edge, alone, where the trees were thick enough to give her privacy for the 30 seconds that the transformation required. The pack mind opened immediately, linking her to Seth and Jacob and Quill and Embry with the seamless totality of the connection she had spent weeks learning to inhabit. They were already phased. She felt them settle into the linked consciousness with the specific individual quality of each of them: Seth's alert openness, Jacob's compressed readiness, Quill's steadiness, Embry's quick-moving intelligence. She broadcast the final position confirmations through the pack mind without language, the way experienced wolves communicated in the field, images overlaid with spatial information. The tactical map she and Carlisle had built translated into the sensory vocabulary that the pack mind transmitted most clearly. Each wolf received their assignment with the precision of something directly experienced rather than explained. They did not need to acknowledge. The pack mind carried acknowledgement as a given. They took their positions, and they waited. Victoria's army came out of the north. She had been patient and she had been strategic, and her army was both of those things opposite raw newborn chaos moving through the early morning forest with the particular kind of noise that newly turned vampires make when they are operating on hunger rather than discipline, which is to say a great deal of noise. Bella's wolf ears picked them up a full 3 minutes before they reached the clearing's edge, which was 3 minutes longer than the Cullens would have had without the wolves, and those 3 minutes were the difference between a defensive formation and a reaction. She broadcast through the pack mind: "They're coming. North edge, count suggests 20 or more." She felt the information land in each of her wolves with the instantaneous efficiency of the pack mind's transmission. No delay, no loss of fidelity, the tactical update arriving simultaneously in 5 places at once. Edward read the army's minds as they approached and relayed the count to Carlisle with the speed of a man for whom thought and speech have always been nearly simultaneous. 22 newborns. No coherent formation. Moving fast and without coordination in the specific manner of vampires who have been turned recently enough that their individual strength is enormous and their collective intelligence is nil. This was Victoria's deliberate choice. Newborns are not trained, not disciplined, not capable of the strategy that older vampires bring to a fight. They are a flood. They are overwhelming force deployed without precision, designed to bury a defending position under sheer weight of numbers. Victoria had built this army for a Cullen-only defense. 7 vampires, no matter how skilled, could not hold against 22 newborns without significant losses. The math was that simple and that brutal. And it was the math Victoria had been calculating since Seattle, patient and certain. The math had not accounted for 5 wolves in the clearing. The newborns hit the clearing's edge and encountered something they had not been prepared for, because Victoria had not known to prepare them for it, because Victoria had believed the pack and the Cullens would never coordinate. What they encountered was a defensive line with no precedent in vampire warfare. Cullens and wolves in formation, each compensating for the other's vulnerabilities with the precision of a strategy that had been worked out between people who understood both sides of the equation. The wolves took the center. This was Bella's tactical decision, and it was correct. Wolves in their phased form are nearly impossible to incapacitate in the way that decapitation or fire incapacitates a vampire, and the newborn's greatest advantage was their individual strength, which a wolf's body could absorb and answer. The Cullens flanked. Jasper, who had a century of military experience that had been earned in a context far bloodier than this clearing, and who moved through a combat situation with the eerie calm of someone who has done this so many times that it has become procedure, took the left flank with Alice moving beside him, with her gift running in full. She could not see wolf futures and could not fully see the army's coordination, but she could read the individual trajectories of the vampires she could see with the complete accuracy that had always made her terrifying in a fight. Emmett took the right with the particular quality he brought to combat situations that was best described as joy. Not bloodlust, not aggression for its own sake, genuine, uncomplicated delight at the experience of being very strong and using it. Edward fought at the center right, where his gift gave him the advantage it always gave him in combat, the ability to read every opponent's intention before the intention became action, to be 3 moves ahead of every exchange. To move through a fight the way a chess player moves through a game with access to the other side's hand. He did not fight with Emmett's joy or Jasper's cold procedure. He fought with focus and a specific, directed ferocity that Bella, in the peripheral awareness of the pack mind and the wolf's sensory field, registered as him. Fully him. The version of Edward that had been managing his own nature for a century, in the context of the Cullen family's careful restraint, now doing the thing his nature was actually built for. The battle did not resolve in minutes. It was not clean. Newborns are individually strong enough that even coordinated opposition requires sustained effort to overcome. And 22 of them moving without discipline through a clearing occupied by 12 defenders is a chaotic, sustained, physically punishing engagement that does not allow for the clarity of narrative overview while it is happening. It is noise and heat and the specific sensory overload of a wolf at maximum arousal, every smell amplified, every sound present. The pack mind running at full volume with 5 sensory feeds contributing simultaneously, which is simultaneously the most overwhelming and the most powerful state a wolf can operate in. Seth fought his first real battle in that clearing. He had been trained. He was not unprepared. But training and engagement are different in the way that understanding the words swimming and being in water are different, and Seth Clearwater in his first real fight was discovering that the difference mattered, and then discovering, over the course of the first several minutes, that he could bridge it. He was fast, faster than he'd been in training. The specific acceleration that comes from the removal of the safety margin that training always maintains. He made one significant error in the first exchange. A positioning mistake that left his left side exposed in a way that a more disciplined opponent would have exploited catastrophically, and that a newborn, in the chaos of its own hunger-driven aggression, did not notice in time. He corrected. He did not make the same mistake twice. Jacob fought with the particular quality of someone who is very good at something and is performing it for the first time at scale. He was the largest wolf in the clearing, larger than Embry, larger than Quill, larger even than the wolves of Sam's pack who had been phasing longer. The alpha bloodline expressed fully in wolf form as it had in Bella's, a size and strength that was disproportionate to his human frame and matched to his genetic lineage rather than his physical history. He was not elegant. He was effective. He moved through the newborns on his section of the clearing with a blunt, complete force that did not require elegance and got the result that elegance achieves by other means. Quill and Embry ran the southern perimeter together with the pack-mind coordination that had made the wolves of La Push effective for 2 years before any of this. The wordless tactical communication of 2 wolves who had run together long enough that the pack-mind's transmission of intent was nearly instantaneous. The flank coverage appearing before it was requested. The support arriving before the vulnerability had fully developed. Bella held the center. The russet wolf at the center of the defensive line was not large for a wolf in the specific way that Jacob was large. She was large in a different way, precise, self-contained, moving through the engagement with the particular economy of someone whose physical capability so far exceeds what is required for any individual exchange that effort is never actually the variable. She was not trying hard. She was applying exactly what each moment required, and nothing more, which left her with the consistent available capacity that a center position wolf needed to be the anchor the formation rotated around. She could feel the shape of the battle through the pack mind with a completeness that she could not have achieved through her own single sensory field. 5 feeds simultaneously, 5 positions on the clearing feeding her a tactical picture that was more comprehensive than anything one wolf could build alone. She read it and made adjustments and broadcast them, and the pack responded with the speed that the pack mind enabled, and the formation held. Victoria was not in the formation. Bella had known this from the first moment of engagement. She had been tracking Victoria's scent on the perimeter of the clearing since the army arrived, the specific, deliberate distance-keeping of a vampire who has never been the instrument of her own strategy, who has always been the architect at a remove from the execution. Victoria built things and sent them and watched from the tree line. She had been doing this since Phoenix, since James died, since she had understood that the direct approach was too costly and the indirect approach required patience and construction. She was watching from the north tree line, waiting, maintaining the position from which she could read the battle's progress and decide when to run. Because running was what Victoria did when she calculated that the odds had shifted past the point of her own survival. She had survived this long through that calculation. She was doing it now, in real time, watching her army encounter something it had not been prepared to encounter, watching the math of the battle revise itself away from the outcome she had built toward. The moment Bella identified as the tipping point came at approximately the 40-minute mark, when the newborn numbers had dropped below a threshold that even the most optimistic remaining vampires in the army could read as viable. Victoria read it too. She had been reading it for several minutes, the calculation running continuously. And she made the decision with the speed that had always been her primary physical attribute. She was the fastest thing in her environment in almost every environment she had ever occupied. And she moved when she decided to move. She ran north. Bella went through the northern tree line before Victoria had covered 50 meters. She had the direct line. Victoria was moving with speed and experience along a path that curved to avoid the densest sections of forest, the calculated route of someone who has scouted terrain in advance, and Bella was moving in a straight line with the wolf's capacity to take terrain at full speed regardless of what the terrain contained. She was not faster than Victoria. She was cutting an angle that made the speed differential irrelevant. She intercepted her in a stand of old growth for 200 meters north of the clearing, where the trees were large enough and close enough together that Victoria's speed advantage narrowed because the speed could not be fully deployed in the space available. And Bella's wolf form's ability to move through dense terrain at close quarters was an advantage that counterbalanced it. Victoria turned when she realized the interception was complete. She had no choice at that point, except to face what had followed her. And she turned with the particular quality of a creature who has survived as long as she has, by never being caught unprepared, by always having a response available, by being the thing in the room that is still moving and calculating when everything else has stopped. She looked at the wolf, and her expression, for the first and only time in the entirety of her careful, patient, grieving campaign against Bella Swan, showed something genuine. Not fear, precisely. She was too old for the immediate experience of fear in the way humans experience it. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a predator who has been outmaneuvered by something she underestimated, and who knows it, and who is in the last seconds of having that knowledge. Bella's wolf felt no emotional complication about Victoria. This was the specific clarity she had never found in proximity to Edward, that bifurcated experience, the wolf's threat reading running simultaneously with the human heart's love, the two signals operating on different frequencies without resolving. Victoria produced no bifurcation. Victoria was pure wrongness, pure threat. The complete and unambiguous reading of a predator who came to this forest to kill the person Bella was. The wolf did not hesitate, and Bella did not ask it to. She killed Victoria the same way she had killed James, with the total conviction of an animal acting on an instinct that had been waiting for exactly this use. The fight was brief and completely without mercy, and it was over before the sound of it could carry back to the clearing. When it was done, Bella stood in the old-growth fur with the remains of the vampire who had built an army to end her, and felt the pack mind register the resolution through the sensory field she was broadcasting. Seth and Jacob and Quill and Embry all receiving the information simultaneously, the tactical completion landing in each of them with the efficiency the pack mind always delivered. She phased back to human in the silence of the old-growth trees, and her hands were shaking. Not from cold. She sat on the damp forest floor and breathed and let the shaking run its course. Because the shaking was the human response to what the wolf had done without hesitation, and the human needed a moment to process it. She was not sorry. She was not traumatized. She was 17 years old, and she had just killed 2 vampires, and the shaking was simply the body's honest accounting of the gap between what it had done and what it had been built to do a year ago. Edward arrived before she finished phasing back. He came through the trees from the south with the speed that vampire pursuit of a sound enables, and he stopped when he found her sitting on the forest floor with her hands between her knees. He read the scene. He read her. He did not keep his distance. He crossed the remaining space between them and crouched in front of her and took her face in both of his cold hands, and she looked at him and held still and let him. And whatever her wolf instincts were doing in that moment, she was stronger than them. The aggression response was present. It was always present. She had stopped expecting it to disappear. And she was holding it with the control that weeks of practice had built into something that now felt less like effort and more like choice. He held her face, and she let him, and neither of them said anything, because the thing between them in that moment in the old-growth fur was past the point where language improved it. She put her hands over his, and the temperature differential was what it had always been, cold stone under warm living skin, and she held on. The Volturi arrived while the clearing was still being addressed. There had been no warning that was useful to act on. Alice had seen them in the last hour of the battle, the vision arriving with the quality of something that had been building just outside the range of her sight and then crossing into it, Jane and Alec and Felix and Dimitri and a contingent of the guard, moving from the south with the Volturi's characteristic unhurried certainty. The Volturi did not rush. The Volturi had been enforcing vampire law for 3,000 years, and they moved through every situation with the posture of people who understand that the situation will wait for them, because in their experience it always has. Alice had told Carlisle as soon as the vision cleared. Carlisle had told the others. The clearing had been reorganized accordingly, not defensively. Not in the specific language of a prepared military response, but in the way that a group of people who have just finished a significant thing reorganizes when they understand that the significant thing is not yet finished. The Cullen family was present and intact. Bella's wolves were in human form at the clearing's edge, which was the form for negotiation rather than combat, which was the form she had decided was correct for the next conversation. She and Edward had come back from the old growth fur to find this. She had phased long enough to broadcast the situation through the pack mind to her wolves, then phased back to human and stood with Edward at the clearing center while the Volturi emerged from the south tree line. Jane came first, as she always did. Jane Volley came first because she was the point of the Volturi's enforcement operations, the instrument whose presence established the terms of every encounter before a word was spoken. She was small and pale and ancient in the way that the oldest vampires are ancient, not decrepit but compressed, the centuries worn into something very dense and very still. She moved through the clearing's remains with the particular fastidiousness of someone who finds the evidence of violence distasteful not because it is violent but because it is untidy. Alec came beside her, which was the formation they always maintained. The two complementary gifts walking in tandem, Jane's ability to induce pain and Alec's ability to remove sensation entirely. The attack and the paralysis that together had made the Volturi enforcement operations functionally unbeatable in the field for centuries. Felix and Dimitri positioned at the guard's rear. The contingent moved with the coordinated precision of people who have done this thousands of times and know exactly where to stand. Jane took in the clearing. She did it with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. The newborn remains, the Cullen family intact and present, the four people at the clearing's edge who were not vampires, and whose presence was visibly at odds with her expectations of what this scene should contain. The Cullens having defeated an illegal army of newborns was not a problem for the Volturi. It was technically a service, the removal of a violation of vampire law that the Volturi would otherwise have had to address themselves. Jane was not going to acknowledge this. The acknowledgement would require her to express something that functioned as gratitude, and Jane did not have that vocabulary. What she had was the charge she had decided on before she arrived. She looked at Bella. "The situation here is irregular," she said. Her voice had the quality it always had, precise, flat, containing the particular cadence of someone who has been the authority in every room they have entered for 300 years and has stopped compensating for it. The Cullen coven has been operating in coordination with dogs. She used the word with the specific contempt of the Volturi's historical relationship with wolf-adjacent species, centuries of conflict and near-extinction campaigns compressed into a single syllable. This is a violation of the established order that we are here to address. Carlisle stepped forward. This was his role in any Volturi interaction, the diplomatic interface. The voice with the longest history with Arrow, the person most capable of translating the situation's reality into terms that the Volturi's governance framework could receive. He was extraordinarily good at this. He had been doing it since 1692 when he had left Volterra and begun building a different kind of existence. And the relationship he maintained with Arrow was the specific relationship of two people who respect each other's intelligence without sharing each other's values. The newborn army was built by Victoria specifically to circumvent both our family's defenses and the Quileute Pack's patrol territory, Carlisle said. He spoke with the calm of someone who has prepared this argument and knows it is sound. The threat to the human population of Forks was genuine and immediate. The coordination was a response to a specific tactical reality, not a change in the established relationship between our families and the Pack. The result is the same, Jane said. The line between your kind and theirs has been blurred. The precedent is unacceptable. The precedent is already set, Carlisle said, by the Treaty of 1936, which established a cooperative relationship between the Cullen family and the Quileute wolves that your own records acknowledge. We have been living adjacent to the Pack for 2 years without incident. Adjacent, Jane said, not allied, not romantically entangled. Her gaze moved back to Bella, not harboring a shapeshifter within the Coven's protection. She paused, allowing the pause to carry the weight she intended. The wolf must be dealt with. She has inserted herself into vampire affairs in a manner that constitutes a violation we are not prepared to overlook." Edward moved before Jane finished the sentence. He stepped in front of Bella with the speed that vampire movement enables, not the considered, deliberate movement of someone making a symbolic gesture, but the immediate physical response of a person whose body has moved before the decision was fully conscious. He was simply there, between Jane and Bella, in the space that had not been occupied a moment before. Emmett moved to Edward's right. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Emmett's presence communicated everything his silence contained, the particular quality of someone very large who has decided that this is the position they are holding and is at complete peace with whatever that decision produces. Jasper moved to Edward's left. His hand was at his side. His expression was the battlefield expression, not the careful management of his gift that defined his daily existence in the Cullen household, where the emotional field of the people around him required constant navigation, but the state he moved into when management was no longer the operative mode. Jasper, in a combat situation, was a completely different vocabulary of person, and Jane, who was very old and very smart, was reading it. Carlyle stepped to the front. He was the last person any situation wanted to have step out of a diplomatic role, because his willingness to do it was a signal that the diplomatic frame was no longer available, and the Volturi had never found what came after Carlyle's diplomacy comfortable. He stepped forward, and the entire Cullen family was standing in a line between Jane and Bella, and the line was not a gesture. It was a statement of collective intention from 7 vampires who were individually capable and collectively something that Jane's tactical calculation, she was always running a tactical calculation, the way a machine runs a process continuously in the background, was finding increasingly unfavorable. Bella was already moving. She phased. The transformation in the clearing, in full view of the Volturi guard, was not something she had deliberated. It was the correct response to the situation in the way that certain things are correct, with a clarity that bypasses deliberation. In wolf form, she was a different tactical proposition than in human form. Not because she was more dangerous, though she was, but because in wolf form she was immune to Jane in the specific, confirmed, lore-established way that phased wolves are immune to Jane's gift. Jane's power works by inducing the sensation of pain through the subject's own neurology, specifically through the pathways of the human nervous system that process pain. A phased wolf is not operating a human nervous system. The mechanism Jane's gift requires does not exist in the target. Jane looked at the russet wolf standing in the clearing. She turned her gift on Bella with the automatic precision of someone reaching for a tool they have carried for 3 centuries, the gift that has made her the Volturi's most feared enforcer, the power that has ended every confrontation that arrived at this point. She directed it at the wolf with the absolute certainty of someone who has never had this moment fail. Nothing happened. The expression that moved across Jane's face in the moment of failure was brief and completely involuntary, and she controlled it within a second, which was a second longer than it took her to control anything else she had ever experienced. She had not prepared for this. She had known, intellectually, that wolves presented certain challenges to certain gifts. The Volturi's records on Quileute Shapeshifters were comprehensive, and the immunity to mental gifts was documented. She had read the documentation. She had not, at any level below the intellectual, believed it would apply to her. She tried again. The russet wolf looked at her with brown eyes and stood in the clearing and was entirely, completely unaffected. The expression that tried to cross Jane's face the second time was something she suppressed completely. But Jasper, whose gift for reading emotional fields was the most precise in the clearing, felt it and filed it. The experience Jane was having was not pain in the physical sense. It was the specific disturbance of someone whose foundational identity is built on a capability that has just, for the first time in living memory, found a limit. Jane was not merely frustrated. She was encountering herself without the power that had defined her for 300 years, and she was encountering this in public, in front of the people she had come to enforce the law against, and it was producing an interior experience that her exterior was working very hard to contain. Her request for Bella's execution had not been judicial process. It was confirmed now, in the failure of her gift, as what it had always been, pique. The judicial frame it had been wearing fell away, and what was underneath was the cold, personal desire to remove the thing that had just demonstrated, in front of witnesses, that she was not unlimited. The Cullen family stood between her and Bella and did not move. And then, at the clearing's northern perimeter, the wolves of Sam Yuli's pack emerged from the tree line. They came silently. This was deliberate. Sam had made a choice about this, and the choice was legible in every detail of the arrival. No sound, no announcement, no aggression display of the kind that a pack approaching a confrontation might make to establish dominance. They simply appeared at the clearing's edge, in wolf form, and took positions along the perimeter with the coordinated precision of a pack that had been running together for 2 years and did not need to communicate through anything as slow as sound. Sam was at the center of the line, large, dark, the alpha's particular quality of stillness that was not passive but organized. The stillness of a creature from which everything else in the field is taking its orientation. He was looking at Jane. He had assessed the situation from the tree line with the comprehensive tactical attention he brought to everything, and he had arrived at a position. He may have disagreed with Bella's choices. He did disagree with Bella's choices, fundamentally and genuinely. And that disagreement had not resolved in the weeks since the pack meeting and the fire and the break. He was not here because he had changed his mind about the treaty or about the wisdom of the alliance Bella had built. He was here because the Volturi were standing in a clearing in Washington state, issuing execution orders about Quileute wolves. And that was something Sam Yulee was never going to tolerate, regardless of any other variable. Bella was Quileute. Whatever she had chosen, whatever pack she was running with, whatever line she was standing on, she was Quileute. The Volturi did not have jurisdiction over that. The Volturi did not have authority over that. And Sam Yulee, who had spent 2 years as the person standing between his community and everything that wanted to cross the line, was not going to stand at the northern tree line while something threatened his people. He and Bella were not aligned. He was here anyway. The math in the clearing shifted. Jane was very good at math. She had been doing this kind of calculation for 3 centuries, assessing the field, counting the variables, determining the cost of the available actions against the benefit they produced. The math had been acceptable when it was 7 Cullens and 1 shapeshifter. It had become less acceptable when it was 7 Cullens and 6 wolves. It became something else entirely when Sam's pack materialized at the northern perimeter, and the clearing contained 7 Cullens and 11 wolves, and the casualty projection for the Volturi's available contingent moved past every threshold that Arrow had authorized for this type of enforcement operation. Arrow was not present. Jane carried his voice, which was not the same as having his judgment available in real time. What she had was the outer limit of the mandate he had given her, and the situation in front of her had exceeded that limit in a way that required acknowledgement. She looked at the Cullen family. She looked at the wolves. She looked at the russet wolf standing at the clearing center, immune to the only instrument Jane had ever needed. She looked at Carlyle, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has been dealing with the Volturi for long enough to know exactly what this moment is, and is giving her the space to handle it with whatever dignity the situation permits. "This matter," Jane said, with the specific precision of someone who has selected their phrasing with great care, "will require consultation with Arrow before any resolution can be formalized." She paused. "The Coven's actions today in addressing the newborn situation have been noted. The irregularities in the broader arrangement will be addressed at a future and more appropriate time." She turned. Felix and Dimitri and Alec turned with her. The contingent moved back through the southern tree line with the same unhurried certainty with which they had arrived, because the Volturi never ran and never appeared to retreat, even when they were doing both. Jane withdrew with the particular elegance of someone who intends you to understand that they are choosing to leave. The threat was deferred. It was not eliminated. The Volturi were never fully resolved. They were simply not worth the cost of the available confrontation on this particular morning, and everyone in the clearing understood this and accepted it, because deferred was the best outcome the morning could produce, and the morning had produced it. The russet wolf watched the tree line until the Volturi's scent was no longer readable on the air. Then she phased back. Bella Swan stood in the clearing between the Cullen family and the wolves of La Push, and breathed the morning air, and felt the specific quality of a thing that has been suspended rather than resolved, and filed it in the category of things she would have to return to. Then she looked across the clearing at Sam Yulee, and held his gaze for a long moment. He held hers. Nothing was said. Everything necessary was transmitted in the specific language of 2 alphas who understand each other well enough to communicate accurately without words. She did not thank him. He did not apologize. They acknowledged each other across the space that still existed between them and would require time to close. It was enough. For now. Sam came to Emily's house the next day. He came in human form, in the middle of the afternoon, and knocked on the door, which meant it was not a pack matter and not a patrol matter, but a personal matter. Because the pack knocked on doors the way the pack did everything, with the understanding that the form of the action communicated as much as the action itself. Bella was there because Emily had asked her to come, and Emily's invitations were the kind that Bella had learned to receive as instruction, because Emily was the person in the pack's world who understood most precisely what was needed and when. Sam sat at the kitchen table across from Bella, and Emily brought tea and then found something to do in the other room with the discretion that made her essential to everything the pack functioned on. Sam looked at Bella with the expression she had learned to read accurately over the months of their relationship, the expression of a man who has processed something completely, arrived at his position, and is now going to deliver it without the inefficiency of self-consciousness. He was not going to apologize. He had held a position in good faith that he believed was correct, and he had acted on it with integrity. And Sam Yulee did not apologize for integrity regardless of how the outcome had developed. He said, "You were right about the tactical reality." She said, "I know." He said, "The territory is safer because of what happened in that clearing. I can't argue with that." She said, "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled of whatever Emily had been baking before Bella arrived, which was something with cinnamon, and the ordinary domesticity of the smell in the middle of this conversation was one of those jarring contrasts that Bella had stopped trying to reconcile and started simply allowing. Life was full of them. "What you did at the meeting," he said. "The command. It didn't complete," she said. "I noticed." He looked at his hands for a moment. The tribal records describe it. An alpha who defers to another alpha's command does so by choice, not biology. When the choice is withdrawn, he stopped. "The command doesn't reach," she said. "You knew," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "I found out the same way you did," she said, "when it didn't work." He nodded. This was apparently the response he'd been expecting, because he received it without surprise. He had been thinking about the implications of Bella's alpha status for weeks, she understood. He was a man who thought about things completely before he discussed them, and what he was delivering now was the considered position rather than the immediate reaction. "The pack structure is changing," he said. "Has been changing since Phoenix. The situation you're living is one the original treaty didn't anticipate, and the pack's history doesn't have a direct precedent for." He looked up at her. "That's going to require adjustment." "Yes," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I've resolved everything," he said. "About the Cullens, about what it means for the community to have a wolf who maintains that kind of relationship with a vampire coven." He was choosing his words with the specific care of a man who has decided that the truth is more useful than the comfortable approximation. "I haven't resolved it. I'm working on it. That's honest," she said. "It's the best I have." She looked at him across the kitchen table and felt something she had not expected to feel in this conversation. Something close to affection. The specific affection of someone who has had a significant and genuine conflict with a person and has come to understand them more clearly through the conflict than they did before it. Sam Yulee was a man of profound conviction operating in a situation that had outpaced his framework, and he was working on the framework rather than defending it past the point of usefulness. She had not been sure he would. "I don't need you to approve of what I have with Edward," she said. "I need to be able to be in the pack and be myself." Both of those things. At the same time. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and rain came against the window with the usual Washington persistence. "I understand that," he said. He did not say it was acceptable. He said he understood it, which was the honest version. It was enough to work with. The formal meeting took place 3 days later at the Quileute Tribal Council's traditional gathering site. A different location from the bonfire ground, a more structured space that the elders used for decisions requiring the weight of the community's recorded history behind them. Old Quileute was present, the oldest living member of the Wolf Council, the keeper of the oral history that had been running in the tribe since before the treaty existed. Billy Black was present, seated in his chair with the specific quality of a man who has known something was coming for a long time and has been preparing for it without being sure he was preparing correctly. The other elders who carried the knowledge were present. On the other side of the space, Carlyle sat with Edward beside him. Esme had come. Alice, who had said nothing explicit about whether she wanted to be here but had been standing by the car when everyone else came out of the house. Bella stood between them. This was not a staging choice made by anyone else. It was where she had walked to when she entered the space, the position she had occupied without deliberation, because it was the accurate one. She was not on either side of the line. She was the reason the line was being redrafted. Old Quill spoke first, which was the protocol. He spoke in the particular way of the elders, formally, with the full weight of the tradition behind each word, nothing extraneous. He acknowledged what had happened. Not the battle, not the Volturi encounter specifically, but the larger event that the world the treaty had been written for in 1936 no longer existed in its original form, and that the treaty was a document written by people who were trying to do the right thing for their community with the information they had, and that the right thing to do with the information available now was different. He said that the core of the treaty was sound, the protection of human life. No biting, no changing, no crossing the line to kill. He said that these provisions would remain. He said that the provisions that had been designed to maintain an absolute separation between the two groups, provisions that were rational in 1936 when the two groups were simply enemies with a shared interest in coexistence, were provisions that required modification in a world where one of the pack's own wolves was in a relationship with a member of the Cullen family, and where that relationship had produced, in the most recent test of it, the protection of the community the treaty was designed to serve. He said this without looking at Bella specifically, which was the respectful version of saying it directly to her. She received it. Carlyle spoke next. He was what he always was in these moments, precise, compassionate, possessed of the long view. He acknowledged the treaty's history with the specific reverence of a man who had been party to its original negotiation and understood what it had represented and what maintaining it had cost both parties over the decades. He said that the Cullen family had no interest in redefining the relationship between vampires and wolves in any terms that diminished the pack's autonomy or the Quileute community's sovereignty over their land and their tradition. He said that what had happened in the clearing was not a template for a standing military alliance. It was a response to a specific threat that had targeted Bella specifically, and that responding to it had required the cooperation it required. He said that the Cullen family would honor whatever terms the council arrived at, and that they said this not as a concession but as a continuation of the posture they had maintained since 1936. Billy Black spoke. He had not looked at Bella since she came in, which was the specific avoidance of a man who has a great deal to say and is managing the order in which he says it. He spoke about Charlie, about the fact that Charlie Swan was the father of the wolf standing between the two groups, and that Charlie had not been told, had not been able to be told, under the current protocol, what his daughter had become and what she was navigating. He said that this was the piece that sat most unresolved with him, and that whatever the council decided about the treaty's terms, the question of how the community cared for the families of the wolves was a question that the decision needed to address. Bella had not planned to speak. She spoke. She said that Charlie deserved to know. She said it knowing what it meant, the conversation she would have to have, the look on her father's face when she told him, the complete reconstruction of everything he thought he understood about his daughter and about the town he had spent his career policing and about the world his life was embedded in. She said it knowing all of that and saying it anyway, because Billy Black was right and the truth was not something her father should be managed around. She said that she was not going to stop phasing. She said this not as a declaration of defiance, but as a statement of fact. She had run as a wolf, she knew what that was. And she was not going to spend eternity in human form when the wolf was part of who she was. The aging question had resolved itself by virtue of this. As long as she phased, she would not age past the girl who had walked into that ballet studio in Phoenix. She was not going to pretend this was a tragedy. It was the opposite. It was the answer to the question she had been asking since the first week she had known Edward, the question of how you stay when the thing you love is permanent, and you are not. She said that she was Quileute and she was Edward's, and both of those were going to be true for a very long time, and she understood if the council needed time to hold both things simultaneously, because she had needed time too, and the time was worth taking. Old Quill looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The treaty amendment was not a single document, because the treaty had never been a single document. It was a living relationship between two groups of people who had chosen coexistence over conflict, and living relationships did not amend by signature. They amended by understanding. The council and the Cullen family left that room with a shared understanding that was more detailed and more honest than the one they had arrived with, and that was the amendment. The core held. The rigid separation that had made Bella's situation impossible was restructured to accommodate the reality that the line was not always where it had been drawn in 1936. The line remained. It was drawn more accurately. She found the cliff on a wolf run 3 weeks before the meeting, during one of the late evening patrols when the pack was spread across the northern perimeter and she had been running the coastal section alone, which was the section she preferred because the Pacific was visible through the trees for long stretches, and the smell of salt water was one of the few sensory inputs that her wolf and her human processed identically. The cliff was not dramatic in the way of cliffs in stories. It was not a precipice over crashing waves. It was a long, flat shelf of rock extending from the coastal bluff over a 40-foot drop to the water below, covered in seagrass at the edges where the soil held, and it faced northwest so that the sunset hit it from an angle in the evening and the morning light came from behind. She had stood on it in wolf form and felt the wind off the water and felt entirely. Simply herself in the specific way that only running in wolf form produced, not the managed self of her human existence, not the controlled, curation-maintaining, alpha-commanding self of her pack responsibilities, but the bedrock version. The self that was underneath all the management. She had gone back there twice in human form before she brought Edward. She brought him on a Thursday evening in late November, driving out to the coastal road and walking the trail through the shore pines to the cliff's edge with him beside her. She had not told him where they were going. He had not asked, because he had learned, with the specific patience of a person who had spent a century getting everything wrong and was committed to getting this right, that there were things she would tell him when she was ready, and that asking was not the method that produced readiness. He stood on the cliff beside her and looked at the Pacific in the late light, and she looked at him, looking at it. He was exactly as he had always been. This was one of the facts of her existence, that Edward Cullen was permanently the person he was at the moment of his turning in 1918, that nothing he experienced added the physical evidence of experience the way it did on a human face, that he carried a century and 8 years of existence in a body that showed none of it. She had spent months being afraid of the asymmetry that this would produce between them. She had spent months planning to resolve the asymmetry by becoming what he was. She did not need to become what he was. She was going to stay what she was, for a very long time, and what she was would not age, and the asymmetry she had feared was not the asymmetry she was living. What she was living was different. Not the same kind of permanence, not the absolute frozen in time of his existence, which was permanent and irreversible, but the conditional permanence of hers, which required the continuous choice of phasing, and in that requirement carried something his did not. She could stop. She could age. She could choose the human timeline she had been born into if she decided to. She had not decided to, and she was not going to, but the choice was structurally present in her existence in a way it had never been in his, and she had come to understand this as a feature rather than a deficiency. She was not his mirror. She was his complement. Adjacent and distinct, close enough to hold across the gap that would never fully close between what they were. "I used to think," she said, looking at the water, "that the only way this worked was if I became a vampire." "I know," he said. "I was wrong about that. I know that too." He said it with the particular quality of someone who had arrived at the knowledge through a different path than she had, and was glad to find her there at the end of it. "I spent most of last year convinced that the best thing I could do for you was find a way to remove myself from your life, that you would be safer and more whole without the complication of what I am." "You were wrong about that," she said. Comprehensively, he agreed. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the wind off the Pacific moved her hair and did not move his, because the wind had never been able to move anything about Edward Cullen that he did not consent to having moved. She had found this maddening once. She found it specific, and his now. One of the 10,000 particular things that constituted him, that she had been accumulating in the specific way of someone who has decided to know a person completely. "I'm going to be here for a long time," she said. "So am I," he said. She reached out and took his hand. Cold stone under warm living skin, the temperature differential identical to every other time she had done this since Phoenix. A constant that she had stopped trying to resolve and started treating as the texture of what they were together. He held her hand with the careful, present quality that he brought to physical contact with her now. The quality that had replaced his previous careful restraint. Because careful restraint had been appropriate when she was breakable and she was not breakable anymore, and the relationship they were building had grown into a different shape than the one they'd started with. They were not the same kind of immortal. They were not the same kind of being. They did not belong to the same world in the simple, unambiguous way that belonging worked when the two people in question were the same species. She was a wolf. A wolf who was also a girl from Phoenix, who had moved to Forks to live with her father, and had walked into a biology class on a Tuesday in September, and sat down next to the most complicated thing that had ever happened to her. He was a vampire who had spent a century being ashamed of what he was, and had spent the past year and a half in the company of someone who looked at him and did not see a monster, and had eventually, with great difficulty and through a great deal of evidence, started to believe it. They were bound for eternity through a chemistry that their respective biologies said was impossible, and that they had chosen anyway, every day, with the specific deliberateness of people who understand that the choosing is the point. The gap between what they were had not closed. The gap was still there, exactly as wide as it had always been. And they were standing on either side of it and holding hands across it, and the gap was the most interesting thing about what they had built. She looked at the Pacific in the late November light and felt the wolf's contentment, the deep animal satisfaction of a creature at rest in its correct environment, which was here, on this cliff. With the salt wind and the sound of water 40 feet below and everything that needed to be settled mostly settled, and the work that remained clearly visible and worth doing. She felt Edward beside her with the specific warmth that was not temperature. He did not produce warmth, but presence. The specific, irreplaceable presence of the person who had become the fixed point of her life in the way that the magnetic north is a fixed point, not a destination but an orientation, the thing everything else arranges around. Forks was below them, behind the shore pines, its lights beginning to come on in the early dark. Charlie was in the kitchen on Maple Street, probably making something inadequate for dinner, probably watching a game on television with the sound low the way he did when he was actually thinking about something else. He knew now. He knew what his daughter was, what her grandmother had carried, what the Quileute history of his ex-wife's bloodline had deposited in his only child. The conversation had been one of the most difficult of Bella's life, and most of the difficulty had been watching her father absorb the truth with the particular precision of a man who is used to receiving information that changes what he understands about a case he thought he had closed. He had not said much. He had listened and processed, and at the end he had said, "Are you all right?" And she had said yes, and he had said, "Okay then," which was Charlie Swan's version of everything the moment contained. He had not said anything about Edward for 3 days after that. On the 4th day he had said, "He's not going to hurt you." Not a question. She had said, "No, he's not." He had said, "Okay then," again, which was the whole of his official position on the matter, and the whole of what she needed from him. La Push was to the west, beyond the shore pines, where the pack ran the perimeter in the early evening, and Emily's house had its lights on, and Sam Yulee sat with his community and worked on the framework that had not yet fully accommodated the reality he was living in. He would get there. She had developed a specific confidence in Sam's capacity to arrive at the right position eventually, even when the journey was longer than she would have chosen. He was not her enemy. He was her pack, at a remove, across a distance that was closing. Jacob was on the evening patrol. She could feel the shape of him and the general awareness she maintained of her wolves even outside the pack mind's direct connection, the specific warmth of his presence in the territory. The patrol route she knew he was running. He was still angry. He was going to be angry for a while longer, she thought, because the grief that the anger was managing was real, and the grief required its own timeline that she could not hurry. He had chosen to be here. He had chosen her pack over Sam's command, and was continuing to choose it, every day. With the specific daily deliberateness of someone who has decided that love for a person is more important than agreement with their choices. She loved him for it. She had told him so, directly, in the specific way she had learned to speak to Jacob, without softening, without the diplomatic cushioning that made difficult truths easier to say and harder to receive. He had said he knew. He had said it in the tone of someone who is not yet ready to say more and knows himself well enough to know it. She was going to be here for a long time. He was going to figure out what to do with that, in time. The sun finished going down behind the Pacific, and the sky went the specific deep blue of a Washington coastal evening in late November, not black yet, but committed to getting there. The stars becoming visible in the east where the sky had gone fully dark above the Olympic peaks. The water below the cliff caught the last light and held it for a moment, and then released it. She was 17 years old. She was going to be 17 years old for a very long time. She was a wolf, and she was a girl, and she was in love with a vampire, and she had killed 2 of his kind without hesitation, and stood down the Volturi in wolf form, and challenged an alpha, and broken a command that couldn't break, and built a pack of her own out of the people who had chosen the direction she was walking. She had done all of this without a plan, without preparation, without any framework that could have told her in advance what any of it was going to cost or what it was going to build. She had done it because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it was not a version of herself she recognized. Edward's hand was cold in hers, and the wind was on her face, and the Pacific was below, and Forks was behind them, and the night was coming in from the east, and everything that needed to be true was true. The two worlds were not merged. They were adjacent. She had decided that was enough, and in the deciding she had made it more than enough. It was everything.